He was a student who dreamed of a career in law.
She was going into criminal justice and ultimately wanted to become a lawyer.
He was an old flame that always got her heart racing.
They're friends with benefits.
Together, they reconnected in a way neither expected.
She was pregnant with this child. There was nothing that was planned.
She was getting together with the father of her child. She was very happy.
But a few short weeks shy of her due date,
get out of the car!
A shocking abduction sent their fiery romance up in flames.
Get in there!
She feels lighter fluid being doused all over her, and then hears a striking of a match.
Next thing she knew, she was on fire, and she hears 2 gunshots. She feels a pain. She knows she's been shot.
In order to capture the assailant, police must enter a sweltering hothouse of lies, deceit, and unspeakable betrayal.
Ma, I've been kidnapped.
Who would ever contemplate harming a pregnant woman? Why would somebody do this in such cold blood?
May 26, 2012, Detroit, Michigan. In the early morning darkness, a frightened 22-year-old woman is fighting for her life. 9 months pregnant, LaTanya Bowman is engulfed in flames. Her first instinct is to try and extinguish the blaze, but as the fire consumes her, LaTanya remains motionless.
She was abducted, bound with duct tape, set on fire, and she heard 2 gunshots. Knowing that she was injured, possibly shot, she made the decision to play dead in an attempt to save her life and the life of her unborn child.
LaTanya's plan works. Believing she is dead, the monster responsible for this crime flees on foot. When the coast is clear, LaTanya puts out the fire and slowly crawls toward her car.
She's gone into survival mode. This guy leaves the keys in the vehicle. She realizes that and she jumps into the vehicle.
Despite her life-threatening injuries, LaTanya somehow finds her way to the home she shares with her mother.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital, move over.
As LaTanya is rushed into the emergency room, doctors are shocked by the severity of her wounds.
And she's got 2nd and 3rd degree burns, and she's shot. She is very seriously injured.
They weren't sure if she was going to survive, if the child was going to survive.
Hospital personnel contacts police and inform them there's been a crime. One so gruesome it turns the stomachs of even the most calloused investigators.
When it rises to the level where it makes a detective sort of raise his eyebrows, it's unusual. And this one was brutal.
Overnight, LaTanya's harrowing ordeal makes headlines across the country. Local police are feeling the heat. They need to solve this crime and solve it fast. But as investigators race to piece together the puzzle, an unimaginable picture begins to emerge. One of pure evil and a sucker punch expectant mother LaTanya Bowman never saw coming.
We think we've seen it all, but we're always amazed by what humans are capable of doing to another human.
Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, LaTanya Bowman knew early on what she wanted to do with her life.
She was studying criminal justice in school.
Well, she had that sort of vibrance about her. You know, she was young and hopeful, and, you know, she wasn't somebody out there that was working the streets.
A dedicated and popular student, by the time LaTanya turned 21, she was well on her way to fulfilling her dreams. She was a senior at a local community college and was on track to graduate ahead of schedule.
She had the whole world ahead of her. She was a hardworking college student and very dedicated to excelling.
And among her legion of friends, there was no one LaTanya enjoyed sharing her hopes and ambitions with more than close friend Jamal Rogers. LaTanya and Jamal had been tight since they first met in high school, nearly 6 years earlier.
Not bad, not bad, not bad.
She thinks that this guy is a great guy, and in fact, she told her mother that he's just the nicest guy she's ever met.
Tall, dark, and handsome, LaTanya had long harbored a soft spot in her heart for Jamal. In fact, their connection had never been strictly platonic.
They did pretty much have an on-again, off-again relationship. Both of them described it that way, or more like friends with benefits.
While their physical attraction for one another was undeniable, the two friends felt it best to keep their relationship an open one.
was really a different kind of relationship. LaTanya had seen other people and has had Jamal, and they were both aware of that, but they would still get together and be intimate and enjoy each other's company.
But in the fall of 2011, LaTanya and Jamal's relationship took an unexpected turn.
Got some good news for you.
Oh, yeah? What's up?
I'm pregnant.
LaTanya wanted him to make the decision to be a part of this child's life, and I really think to be in her life as well. He's a good guy. He's a good friend. And I think she perhaps saw a future with him.
While LaTanya embraced the idea of parenthood, to her surprise, Jamal didn't share her enthusiasm.
Initially, Jamal was very reluctant to have the baby and initially wanted LaTanya to have an abortion.
You plan on keeping it?
Yes, Jamal, I plan on keeping it. Where did that come from?
I think when she got pregnant, Jamal kind of broke off contact for a while.
What? Jamal.
But by the time LaTanya reached her third trimester, Jamal had rekindled their relationship and was as excited about the baby as she was.
So, what about Glendon?
Glendon? Gillespie.
No.
Come on, that's original. Come on, nobody's got that name.
They were discussing names for the baby. This was, getting very close, and they started to go out and see more of one another.
With their relationship back on track, the couple made plans for a date at a local drive-in theater.
Why don't we go to the movies or something? Let's go hit the drive-in or something.
The drive-in?
Yeah, we're not gonna have any time once the baby comes, so we might as well go live a little bit.
You got a point.
Exactly, don't I, baby?
In her eyes, she was getting together with the father of her child to talk through some issues that, of course, two expectant parents are going to have to deal with.
On Friday, May 25th, 2012, LaTanya drove her SUV to the home Jamal shared with his mother. After picking him up, the two headed to the nearby city of Dearborn for a midnight showing at the drive-in. As they watched the film, the two reconnected in ways neither expected.
Baby, look. Now, you know I'm always here for you, right?
Prove it. So I don't
Prove
believe
it.
you. I don't believe
What
it
I gotta
right
do
now.
to prove it, huh?
I don't know.
Baby.
You tell me.
Come here, girl.
They had sex there in the car at the drive-in.
For LaTanya and Jamal, this passionate encounter seemed to cement the rock-solid nature of their relationship. But little did they know that in a few short hours, their lives would take a horrific turn, leaving a young woman fighting for her life and a community desperate for answers.
All of a sudden, she can smell accelerant. And then she kind of hears a click. And the next thing she knows, she can hear crackling. And it's her hair that's on fire.
Yeah.
LaTanya Bowman and Jamal Rogers had been friends since high school, but it didn't take long for the relationship to become more than mere friendship. In September of 2011, LaTanya became pregnant with Jamal's child. And after shaking off a case of cold feet, Jamal seemed ready to be a loving boyfriend and father.
They sort of rekindled their relationship, I guess, or at least were going to try.
The couple's love for each other seemed so intense that just a few weeks before their child was due, Jamal and LaTanya shared a heated tryst at a local drive-in.
They had sex there in the car, in the SUV at the drive-in that they had went to.
But just when it seemed the couple's relationship couldn't get any more perfect, the unthinkable happened. Early on May 26, 2012, just hours after her and Jamal's romantic evening at the drive-in, LaTanya was abducted from Jamal's garage by an unknown assailant. Bound and gagged, she was lit on fire, shot, and left for dead.
The crime that LaTanya Bowman was a victim of has to rank as one of the most heinous.
I think even for a city like Detroit, the nature of this crime was shocking.
Now, as LaTanya fights for her life and the life of her unborn child in the hospital, police begin to try and piece together what happened. But the key to cracking the case comes down to one important factor.
I needed to talk to the victim. I needed to hear what happened firsthand from her.
Shot in the shoulder and suffering from second and third degree burns, LaTanya has been transferred to the hospital trauma unit. But despite her life-threatening injuries, she's remained conscious throughout her ordeal.
LaTanya, I'm Detective Barnes. Just wanted to ask you a few questions, if I could. Tanya, I know you're hurting, but I'd like to go through the events of last night. Can you just start from the beginning and tell me what happened?
Visibly shaken, LaTanya lays out the frightening details of her abduction.
Jamal and I went to the drive-in, and I drove back home, and he said that he was gonna open the garage door.
Hey, right here. Let me go open up the garage so you can back in.
Okay.
According to LaTanya, Jamal opened the garage. Just as she parked the car, all hell broke loose.
While inside of the garage, an unknown person came up and grabbed her and held a gun to her head.
Get out of the car! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
LaTanya tells detectives she did her best to comply with her assailant's demands.
She's in no condition to fight, being 9 months pregnant, so she just complies with what the gunman asked her to do.
The tape didn't cover the bottom of her eyeglasses, so she was able to sort of see just glimpses of the skin on his wrist.
She never sees the person behind her, but her hands are tied up, her feet are bound, her mouth is taped, and she's thrown in the backseat of the vehicle.
Get in the car! I said get in there!
With LaTanya bound and blindfolded, her assailant jumped behind the wheel and took off.
The next thing I know, it felt like we were driving.
Everything happened so quickly, LaTanya isn't sure if Jamal is safe and sound inside the house or had also been attacked.
She's thinking to herself, whatever happened to Jamal, but even more importantly, what's happening to me? How do I protect my baby? How do I get out of this?
LaTanya claims her assailant drove for several minutes before stopping in what seemed to be a remote area. LaTanya hoped her nightmare was nearing an end. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse.
The gunman had opened the door, and then she remembers feeling a liquid being poured on. She could smell a gassy substance. And she said next thing she knew, she was on fire.
As she feels her hair and her body catching fire, she rolls out of the car and begins rolling around frantically trying to put the fire out.
She described the smell of her burning hair, the crackling of her skin burning. It had to be a horrific set of circumstances for her to live through.
But as LaTanya attempted to extinguish the flames, she suddenly heard a loud pop.
She hears 2 gunshots, one of which strikes her. Believing that she'll be dead soon, she instinctively plays dead.
Miss Bowman performed an amazingly heroic act of having the strength while you're still on fire to be able to play dead. It is just an amazing thing given those horrific circumstances. And the assailant then walked away.
LaTanya tells detectives that once she was sure her abductor had fled the scene, she put out the flames and shook herself free from the duct tape binding her hands and feet.
I heard him run off. When I thought that he was gone, I crawled to the car.
She doesn't have her cell phone at the time that was taken by the gunman. She sees a gas station that she's familiar with. She goes and uses the phone there.
LaTanya doesn't call 911. She's less concerned with her own safety than she is her mother's.
Ma, I need for you to leave the house. I'm coming to get you.
She thinks her mother is next, and her mother's in grave danger. And somehow, even without her glasses, even in great pain, she manages to get to her mom's house.
Oh my God, what happened to you? Let's go to the hospital. Move over.
Shocked by the sight of her daughter's condition, her mother jumped in the car and rushed LaTanya to the hospital.
It's incredible that she lived. This young woman was her own hero.
Police are astonished by LaTanya's chilling story. But just what could have prompted the attack? And why was LaTanya so gravely concerned about her mother's safety? Apparently, it wasn't the first time a threat had been made against their family.
She's worried about her mother because 2 weeks earlier, there was an incident where a man came to the door very early in the morning. Mom opens the door. Guy sticks a gun in Mom's face. Pulls the trigger, but nothing happens. And he just kind of runs off.
Miss Bowman thought, oh my God, does this have anything to do with that incident? Does this have anything to do with my mother?
Judging by the timing of the two events, LaTanya can't help but fear the worst.
She believes the incident that happened at her house a few weeks earlier is related to what happened to her this evening.
We'll be in touch. Get some rest.
For detectives, LaTanya's statement provides the first break in the case. But before they can follow up on this new lead, they must answer an even more pressing question. Is the father of LaTanya's unborn child, Jamal Rogers, alive and well? Or has he met a fate even worse than hers?
Where was Jamal? We needed to go find him.
In Detroit, a terrifying crime has taken place involving the unlikeliest of victims. 9 months pregnant, LaTanya Bowman was abducted, set on fire, and shot. Amazingly, LaTanya tricked her assailant into believing she was dead.
The whole time she's thinking about her baby. And that's what gave her the courage to play dead. It saves her life.
And after her attacker fled the scene, LaTanya made her way to the hospital, but not before checking on her mother to make sure she hadn't been targeted as well.
I've been kidnapped.
In speaking with detectives, LaTanya reveals that the assault might be related to a separate incident that occurred only a couple weeks earlier.
2 weeks prior to the attack, an unknown male showed up at LaTanya's mom's house. When she came to the door, he pointed a gun in her face and pulled the trigger. But the gun did not fire. The male then ran off.
Adding to the mystery is the fact that police aren't sure if LaTanya's attacker also went after Jamal, the father of her unborn child. While one team of officers conducts welfare checks at both LaTanya and Jamal's residences, others fan out across the city in an effort to determine the exact location of the vacant lot where the shooter abandoned LaTanya.
Well, the first thing you think of is this guy shoots somebody and then throws the gun in the street someplace and some 3-year-old finds it. It was a top priority to find that gun. The shell casings, anything we could find in relation to the crime.
But given that LaTanya was blindfolded during the attack, locating the crime scene proves easier said than done.
It was difficult for her to describe a lot of the things around her because it was dark.
So we drove around, hoping to find some evidence of the scene. We were unable to do that.
It's not long before detectives hit another roadblock, hoping to establish a possible link between LaTanya's abduction and the earlier threat made on her family. Detectives reach out to her mother, Angela Beatty.
So I understand from LaTanya that you had some sort of confrontation.
Yeah, it was about 2 weeks ago.
But not only is LaTanya's mother unable to ID the man who allegedly threatened her, she's unsure the two events are even related.
I don't really think it has anything to do with LaTanya at all. I just figured somebody might have just been mad.
LaTanya's mom worked for the city, so sometimes you're dealing with irate citizens, etc. And based on that, she felt it had nothing to do with what happened to LaTanya.
Absolutely not.
Just when it seems like the case has hit a dead end,
Barnes,
detectives receive some promising news from their fellow officers.
you have him there.
Jamal Rogers is alive and well.
Thank you for your time. We need to go.
Officers encountered him during the welfare check of his house, the same house where LaTanya was kidnapped. Detectives are eager to hear his version of the attack.
Jamal Rogers?
Yes.
Need to ask you some questions about LaTanya Bowman.
Surprisingly, Jamal's account of what happened couldn't be more different than LaTanya's.
Jamal said that they left the drive-in theater, came back to his house on Sherman, and parked at the curb.
She dropped you off here?
Yeah, she dropped me off. Yeah, we were out there at the curb, talked for about maybe 10 minutes or so. Then I got out and she drove off.
With Jamal's statement at odds with LaTanya's, detectives wonder if Jamal might be withholding information.
You're sure she dropped you at the curb?
Yeah, positive.
That's when Jamal drops a bombshell.
Is there anybody here that can corroborate that?
Yeah, my mom and my girlfriend and my kids.
You have another girlfriend?
Yeah.
And not one, but two children.
This is a guy who's getting a little bit of action because he's got a girlfriend right here and a pregnant pal over here.
Given LaTanya's statement and Jamal's startling revelation, detectives can't help but wonder. Could Jamal's girlfriend have orchestrated LaTonya's abduction out of jealousy? And if so, is Jamal now trying to protect her?
We know that Jamal had watched this whole incident happen in his garage. He knew more than he was letting on.
Hoping to get to the bottom of this mystery, detectives reach out to a number of Jamal's neighbors. They're hoping to glean additional information about the attack on LaTonya. They catch a break when someone in Jamal's neighborhood tells them they saw Jamal and LaTonya return home from the drive-in the night of the crime.
Apparently there's this character who lives in the neighborhood, and this guy had his eyes open, and he saw them go into that garage, backing into the garage with LaTonya.
With an eyewitness backing LaTonya's story, police decide to bring Jamal in for further questioning. Detectives press Jamal to explain why his version of events is so different than either LaTonya's or his neighbors.
He instructs LaTonya to pull into this detached garage from his home so they can finish what they supposedly started at the movie theater.
Jamal changes his story and says, yeah, they did pull into the garage.
So you're out of the car? Yes. So you had to close the garage door. She obviously didn't do it. Correct. Right? Yes.
But before Jamal talks about what happened next, he suddenly has a change of heart.
I think I remember. You want a lawyer? Yeah.
Basically, lawyers up, clams up. That's it. He's done.
Jamal's sudden reluctance to talk raises more than a few red flags with detectives. They decide to hold him in county jail on suspicion of murder. But they're still uncertain whether Jamal's girlfriend could be personally involved. Interviewing her that day, detectives are stunned by what she tells them.
What can you tell me about LaTonya Bowman?
I really don't know that name.
I don't believe that either of the women knew of the other.
Okay, well, were you aware that Jamal was seeing Miss Bowman?
No, I was not.
The fact that Jamal's girlfriend has no idea he's been sleeping with LaTonya seemingly undermines any motive she might have to try and kill her. It also places Jamal alone at the top of the suspect list.
We didn't consider the current girlfriend a suspect, and we believed their relationship at that point didn't come into play.
Desperate for physical evidence, investigators turn their attention to LaTonya's SUV.
Her vehicle was seized, and inside the vehicle, there's some pieces of burned clothing, but there was also a roll of black Gorilla duct tape, which we believe that was the duct tape used by the gunman.
However, DNA tests conducted on both the clothing and duct tape failed to connect Jamal or anyone else to the crime. The case appears to be at a standstill.
The only thing I had going for me at the time was kind of a little bit of hope. I wanted Jamal Rogers to talk to me again.
A few hours later, Detective Barnes' hopes are realized when Jamal Rogers does a surprising about-face.
I almost started to move on to what's the next step going to be. How are we going to identify this other person if Jamal Rogers is not going to give him up? And I walked him all the way back to his cell, and just as I put him in his cell, he said, "Can we talk?"
What does Jamal want to say? He's already lied to investigators once. Would this time be any different? Or is Jamal about to provide detectives with a piece of information that will break the case wide open? On May 26, 2012, expectant mother LaTonya Bowman was kidnapped from inside the garage at the home of her boyfriend, Jamal Rogers. LaTonya was then lit on fire, shot, and left to die in a vacant lot.
So she's been on fire, and then she feels a gunshot. She decides to play dead.
Miraculously, LaTonya survived the terrible ordeal, and the subsequent investigation has led police to the father of her unborn child, Jamal Rogers.
We believe that he was complicit in this abduction and attempt murder.
While initially reluctant to cooperate with police, after being taken into custody, Jamal decides to talk.
He tells cops, "I know who did this."
For detectives, it's a much-needed break in the case.
I just told him that I'm not going to go sit down there and speak to you for 2 hours unless you're going to give me something, so you're going to have to give me a name. And he said, Antonio Valentine Mathis.
Antonio Mathis is no stranger to law enforcement.
He's been in jail, he's done some time, and he's just a really bad guy. And he also happens to be pals with Jamal Rogers. He's his roommate.
Jamal described their relationship, said they were like brothers. He had allowed Antonio to watch his kids. He just trusted him that much.
According to Jamal, he'd recently confided in Antonio about some problems he was having with LaTanya, and his friend offered to lend a hand.
What'd you say to him?
I said I didn't really want to have another baby.
I don't want to have another baby, man. I can't deal with this, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
So he said,
I could take care of it.
Jamal tells detectives he had no idea what Antonio meant when he said he could take care of it, and he was surprised to find Antonio in his garage when he and LaTanya returned home from the drive-in.
I did say something to him when I seen him shouting to the car. I was just, what are you doing? What are you doing? What is this about? And he's just like, I got you. Don't worry about it.
Jamal insists Antonio acted on his own.
I didn't ask him to do it. I didn't ask him to do anything.
Jamal's position was that Antonio took this on his own accord and thought to himself, hey, why don't I help Jamal out and somehow help terminate the baby, get her upset or whatever.
Detectives are anxious to speak with Antonio Mathis. They search the neighborhood where he and Jamal live, but can't find him anywhere. At least not until an unexpected tip comes in.
We received a phone call. It was an anonymous phone call. I learned he was going back over the Sherman address. In fact, our officers were sitting on the crime scene. He was arrested.
Even with Antonio in custody, detectives' hopes of getting a confession are soon dashed.
when they got back at 1:30, you're in the garage.
I never came back to the house that night. I came back to the house the next morning.
He's lying about everything.
I mean, I don't know.
Antonio denies any knowledge of this whole event. He says he just got pointed out as a guy that, because he had a record, he would be a good fall guy.
Antonio also claims he has an airtight alibi. He was with his girlfriend the night of the crime.
She's gonna be your alibi for the whole night. I mean, that's all. What's her name?
The assailant's alibi was a friend of his, Tanisha McCaddy. She picked him up at midnight and drove him to another girl's house. That girl, Crystal King, was with him at the time of the assault.
Investigators suspect Antonio's alibi is bogus. And after speaking with Crystal King and Tanisha McCaddy, that suspicion is justified.
The timeline that he gave us was totally inconsistent with what had actually happened, according to Tanisha McCaddy and his girlfriend.
Tanisha and Crystal both state that Antonio didn't hook up with them until the morning after the crime, which supports the theory that Antonio was the gunman who attacked LaTanya Bowman. But did Antonio act alone? Or did he and Jamal conspire to murder Jamal's pregnant girlfriend? In order to elicit more information from their two prime suspects, detectives make a bold play.
Cops are pretty clever. You know, they're going to start playing these two guys against each other.
I thought we maybe would talk to Jamal again and see if maybe he'd give us a little bit more.
He claims he's innocent. Wasn't anywhere near you and LaTanya. And he's got an alibi and witnesses.
Man, he lying.
Jamal, you're gonna have to give me something concrete, or I'm gonna have to let him go, and you're gonna go down for the whole thing.
I was kind of acting a little mad at him. I told him, this is your last chance. You're gonna give me some evidence that I can corroborate, or that's it. We're done talking.
The two words Jamal utters next will lead detectives to the unlikeliest of locations. A location that will bring them one step closer to putting LaTanya's true attacker behind bars. Police now believe Jamal Rogers is responsible for the attempted murder of LaTanya Bowman, the mother of his unborn child. But Jamal insists he's innocent and pins the crime on his best friend and roommate.
Man, he lying.
He's going to roll over on his buddy, this guy named Antonio Mathis.
Jamal claims that shortly before the attack on LaTanya, he made an offhand comment about not wanting another child. Unbeknownst to Jamal, Antonio took his comment seriously and without his knowledge, orchestrated the hit on Jamal's pregnant girlfriend. However, when Antonio was arrested, he claims no knowledge of the attack on LaTanya.
Antonio said he didn't do anything. It's all Jamal.
According to Antonio, he was with his girlfriend, Crystal King, and pal, Tanisha McCaddy, the night of the crime. But Crystal and Tanisha tell detectives that's simply not the case.
We knew we had the right guy. The question is, Do we have enough to make it stick?
The other question is whether Antonio acted alone, as Jamal Rogers claims, or whether the two men conspired to attack LaTanya.
He's thrown you under the bus. He's going to do whatever he can to save his own ass right now. He already did. He already did. He told us, he told you not to do anything to her. You know what that looks like? You went out and did this on your own.
In an effort to uncover the truth, detectives then decide to play Jamal and Antonio against each other.
Jamal, you're gonna have to give me something concrete, or I'm gonna have to let him go, and you're gonna go down for the whole thing.
Fearful of taking the fall for the crime all by himself, Jamal offers 2 words.
Jamal says,
Home Depot.
I drove him to Home Depot right before I went to go to the movies with LaTanya.
Operating off this information, detectives reach out to a nearby Home Depot. They are able to confirm that the gloves and duct tape found in LaTanya's car were indeed purchased there.
Home Depot was nice enough to provide us with the exact items that he purchased from their shelves. So we had SKU number for the duct tape. We had the exact type of Gorilla duct tape, the exact gloves he bought.
Detectives confront Antonio Mathis with this evidence, but Antonio remains adamant he had nothing to do with the crime.
But I guess he forgot. Home Depot has security cameras.
Police are confident that if the surveillance footage places Antonio at the store, they'll have enough probable cause to charge him with attempted murder. Detective John Barnes screens the security footage, but after 90 minutes, there's still no sign of their prime suspect.
You know, and Antonio hasn't come into the store, and I almost started thinking, what do we do now that we don't have this piece of evidence?
But just as he's about to give up, Detective Barnes finally hits pay dirt.
Right there, look.
I think it was around 9:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the store closed. In walks Antonio Mathis. I knew right then that we'd locked Antonio Mathis into this.
There he goes. He's got the gloves and he's got the duct tape. Yep. That's what we've been looking for.
Even with this video evidence, detectives are still fairly confident that Antonio didn't act alone. They believe Jamal Rogers, already saddled with 2 young children, couldn't bear the thought of having to support another child with LaTanya. And when Antonio told Jamal he could make his problem go away, Jamal jumped at the offer.
I think that Antonio told Jamal, I can take care of this for you. And by take care, we know that means kill her and the baby, and the problem goes away.
On May 29, 2012, police officially charged Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis with unlawful imprisonment, assault with intent to commit murder, and conspiracy. News of Jamal's arrest adds insult to LaTanya's already devastating injuries.
I think she loved him, and she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to believe that he was capable of something like this. And I could understand.
Ironically, the same day charges are filed against the 2 men, LaTanya gives birth to a healthy baby boy.
The baby is fine. Mom, LaTanya, is apparently recovering physically. This is an incredible story of courage and survival.
Over the next year, LaTanya also begins to heal emotionally as she waits for justice to be served.
She went through some tough times, and we weren't going to rest. Not from day one, not until this is over with. And we get the results that she deserves.
On May 22, 2013, the trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis begins in a Macomb County courtroom. In their opening statement, prosecutors assert Jamal Rogers, not wanting to be a father again, asked his friend Antonio Mathis to kill his pregnant girlfriend, LaTanya Bowman.
Obviously, Mr. Mathis was supposed to kill Miss Bowman. She was totally blindsided by the violence that she was subjected to at both of their hands.
Prosecutors then lay out the evidence tying Antonio to the crime. The duct tape and the gloves found in LaTanya's SUV, as well as the security footage that shows Antonio Mathis purchasing them the night of the attack.
Having the Gorilla duct tape in that courtroom and being able to show them, this is what was bought and this is what we found in the car. And them actually seeing that purchase made, that was huge.
After presenting the physical evidence, prosecutors turned to their star witness, LaTanya Bowman. Everyone in the courtroom is mesmerized as she gives a blow-by-blow account of her nightmarish abduction.
She was very calm in her testimony, which is kind of typical of her actions throughout this ordeal. I think the jury was absolutely listening to every word that she said and were undoubtedly impacted.
On the stand, LaTonya admits she had a hard time believing that Jamal was involved in the crime. But she also refutes Jamal's claim that they had sex the night of the abduction.
She denied the sex at the drive-in theater. Jamal seemed to be totally baffled by that, why she's saying that. You know, that was a big part of his case.
But not everything LaTonya testifies to bolsters the prosecution's case. Her inability to concretely identify her assailant is a boon for the defense.
She readily admitted that the defendant was shorter than the man that she felt had abducted her. She really didn't pinpoint my client as being the person that abducted her.
Beyond LaTonya's testimony, the defense also argues that Jamal and Antonio's DNA was never found on the gloves and duct tape, nor was there the usual paper trail left behind when one person solicits another to commit murder on their behalf.
We had shown that there was absolutely no financial things happening between Mr. Rogers and Mr. Mathis. There was no withdrawals or anything like that on Mr. Rogers' part. There was no deposits on top of Mr. Mathis like there normally might be if somebody's asking somebody to commit a crime.
Despite LaTonya's heroic turn on the stand, there seems to be nothing but some security footage linking Antonio to the crime and zero physical evidence implicating Jamal. A guilty verdict seems unlikely. But before the jury weighs in, the prosecution will unveil a surprise witness, one whose shocking testimony will be the deciding factor between two men walking free or being locked up for life. The trial of Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis for the attempted murder of LaTonya Bowman is wrapping up. Armed with a security tape of Antonio purchasing items that were used in the crime, along with LaTonya's gripping testimony, the prosecution is feeling confident.
We were all of the mind that we presented the best case we could possibly present.
But defense attorneys argue there's simply no proof that their clients plotted any murder.
There's no actual concrete evidence of any sort that there was any kind of conspiracy between the people.
However, prosecutors still have one last witness on the docket, Antonio's friend, Tanisa McCaddy. On the stand, Tanisa reveals a detailed conversation she had with Antonio shortly after the attack on LaTonya.
McCaddy, she said he was unusually quiet, and she asked him what was wrong, and he didn't want to tell her, and he just said nothing, but I need you to stay away from me for a while.
If I remember, the exact words may have been, we did some awful to a pregnant woman. So she did testify to that in court, and that certainly didn't sound good at all.
Well, this guy, Antonio Mathis, is a real brain surgeon. I mean, who actually does something like this? And then they talk about it and even brag about it. But that's what Antonio did, and that's what also helped police nail him to the wall.
But is it enough to convince the jury that both Antonio and Jamal were involved in the crime? After 3 hours of deliberations, the jury returns with their verdict. They find Jamal Rogers and Antonio Mathis guilty on all charges.
The first thing we all did is, after hearing guilty of all charges, is we all looked at Miss Bowman, and we all went and hugged her.
2 months later, the two defendants are sentenced to life in prison. The judge has some particularly harsh words for Jamal.
Even though you did not light the match or pull the trigger, you orchestrated perhaps one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You diabolically and in cold blood plotted, schemed, and arranged the murder of your unborn child.
Jamal, once he's sentenced, basically blows a kiss to the audience. It's incredible arrogance.
For LaTonya Bowman, the sentencing serves as a bittersweet end to her tragic relationship with Jamal. And while the physical and emotional scars wrought by his betrayal still linger, LaTonya refuses to be defined by what happened that fateful night in 2012.
You'd think it just...
The snow in Denver does not just fall, it buries. In December of 1989, a brutal, historic blizzard rolled off the Rocky Mountains, locking the mile-high city in a silent, freezing vice. The temperature plummeted past zero, turning the streets into empty sheets of black ice and shrouding the suburbs in a thick, suffocating mist. It was a night when ordinary people stayed inside, huddled close to their fireplaces, ignoring the howling wind shaking their window panes. But in the affluent, quiet neighborhood of Cherry Creek, the silence was shattered at 4:12 a.m. by a sound that did not belong to the storm. A single, sharp, metallic crash echoed down a secluded cul-de-sac, followed by an agonizing, choked scream that was instantly swallowed by the wind. By the time the sun crawled over the frozen horizon, casting a weak, gray light over the snowdrifts, a horror had been uncovered that would scar the city's collective consciousness for generations. A young woman, 19-year-old college student Melissa Vance, lay dead on the pristine white powder of her own front yard, just yards from her family's locked front door. She was dressed in her winter coat, but her boots were missing, her bare feet frozen blue and covered in superficial lacerations as if she had been running for her life across jagged ice. There was no signs of a forced entry at the house, no broken windows, and no struggle inside. The snow around her body, however, told a chaotic, terrifying story. There were two distinct sets of footprints frozen into the crust of the snowdrift, one light, erratic, desperate, turning back on itself in a frantic attempt to escape, the other deep, heavy, measured, and terrifyingly patient. The second set of prints did not run. They had walked with a slow, chilling precision, tracking the girl's panicked flight until the two paths finally collided at the edge of the property. The initial response from the Denver Police Department was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, the quiet, wealthy street was transformed into a militarized zone of flashing red lights, yellow crime scene tape flapping violently in the freezing wind, and grim-faced detectives huddled over the body. The victim's family was prominent. Her father was a federal judge, her mother a respected pediatric surgeon, and the pressure to find answers was immediate, suffocating, and relentless. But from the very beginning, the crime scene presented anomalies that defied explanation. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment revealed that Melissa had not died from exposure, nor had she been subjected to a typical, chaotic assault. The cause of death was a single, highly specialized, and deeply unsettling injury. A clean, vertical puncture wound directly to the back of her neck, severing her spinal cord at the brain stem. It was a strike delivered with surgical accuracy, executed in a fraction of a second by someone who knew exactly how to paralyze and kill without leaving a trace of blood or struggle on her clothes. As the detectives combed through the frozen grass and brushed away the fresh powder, they found no weapon, no discarded fibers, and no foreign fingerprints. The killer had left nothing behind, save for a single, bizarre object placed meticulously inside Melissa's open, frozen hand. Tucked tightly into her palm, as if she had been forced to hold it in her final moments of consciousness, was a vintage, tarnished silver police whistle dating back to the 1950s. On its metal side, a crude, deep scratch had been carved, forming a single, unsettling word: silence. To the lead investigators on shift that morning, the whistle was not just a chilling calling card. It was a direct, mocking challenge to the department. But who would carry such an object, and what did it mean? The community of Cherry Creek, a place where residents routinely left their doors unlocked and let their children play in the streets until dark, collapsed into a state of absolute, paranoid hysteria. The local newspapers seized on the detail of the whistle, running sensationalist headlines about the midnight whistler and the shadow in the snow. Neighbors began spying on neighbors. Every stranger in a heavy coat was treated as a potential monster, and the local hardware stores completely ran out of deadbolts and window locks within 48 hours. The fear was thick, tangible, and suffocating. Yet, despite the public outcry and the mobilization of a specialized task force, the investigation struck a massive, immovable wall. Every logical lead evaporated into the freezing mountain air. Detectives questioned Melissa's classmates at the university, her former boyfriends, her neighbors, and even the delivery drivers who serviced the area, but everyone had an ironclad alibi, secured by the brutal weather that kept the city indoors. The phone logs yielded nothing. The victim's personal journals painted a picture of an ordinary, happy young woman with no enemies, no dark secrets, and no reason to be hunted through the snow in the dead of night. The physical footprints, which had offered the only real hope of tracking the killer, became useless as the blizzard intensified, dumping another 6 inches of fresh powder over the scene before the forensic team could cast them in plaster. The case was rapidly cooling, slipping away from the detectives who had sworn to solve it. In the months that followed, the task force was quietly downsized, its resources diverted to the rising tide of drug-related violence gripping the city's core. The files were compiled into a heavy, black binder and moved from the active desks of the homicide unit to the dim, dusty shelves of the cold case archive in the basement of police headquarters. Melissa Vance became a name spoken only in hushed, sorrowful tones during anniversary retrospectives, a tragic ghost of 1989 whose killer had seemingly melted away with the spring thaw. For 36 years, that heavy black binder remained undisturbed, a monument to a failure that haunted the department's veterans. The silver whistle sat locked in an evidence vault, its carved message of silence holding true as the decades rolled past, the ink on the police reports fading to a dull, yellowed gray. The world moved on, transitioning from the analog era of the late 80s to the highly digitized, hyper-connected landscape of the modern world. New chiefs of police came and went, each promising to review the city's unsolved tragedies, but Melissa's file remained cold, frozen in the amber of a forgotten winter night. But a secret does not stay buried forever, especially when science catches up to the crimes of the past. In early 2026, a young, tenacious cold case detective named Marcus Reyes, armed with a state-of-the-art forensic budget and next-generation DNA extraction technology, decided to pull Melissa Vance's file from the basement. Reyes was not interested in old theories or faded witness statements. He wanted to look at the physical evidence with fresh, unbiased eyes. He bypassed the traditional limited government CODIS database and focused on the silver whistle, specifically the deep grooves of the word silence carved into its side. Using a highly specialized, microscopic vacuum technique designed to pull touch DNA from the porous, microscopic cracks of metal objects, Reyes's team managed to isolate a tiny, pristine sample of male genetic material that had survived 36 years of storage. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to find a digital needle in a global haystack. Reyes uploaded the completed genetic profile to public forensic genealogy platforms, expecting to find perhaps a distant cousin or a dead end. Instead, the algorithm ran its calculations for less than 3 hours before returning a result that did not just solve the case, it threatened to burn the entire Denver Police Department to the ground. The DNA extracted from the killer's calling card did not match a drifter, a transient, or a known sexual predator. It was an absolute, flawless match for a man who had stood at the very center of the original investigation, a man who had comforted Melissa's grieving parents on camera and who had recently retired as one of the most respected law enforcement leaders in the state of Colorado, former police chief Thomas Sterling. The hunter had been the monster all along, and the 36-year-old lie was about to collide violently with the light of day. The revelation of Thomas Sterling's name did not just crack the cold case file open, it sent an immediate, paralyzing shockwave through the upper echelons of the Denver Police Department. In the winter of 1989, Sterling had not yet been the chief of police. He had been a 32-year-old rising star, a fiercely ambitious, hyper-focused detective in the homicide division whose sharp intellect and media-friendly demeanor made him the golden boy of the local press. When Melissa Vance was found dead in the snow, it was Sterling who had rushed to the scene before the perimeter was even fully secured. It was Sterling who had stood before the television cameras, his breath blooming in the freezing air, promising a terrified public that the monster who took Melissa would be hunted down and brought to justice. To understand how a young detective could commit such a chillingly calculated crime and then spend the next 3 decades climbing to the absolute peak of the law enforcement hierarchy, Detective Marcus Reyes had to look backward. He had to look past the grandfatherly, silver-haired retired chief who now sat on the boards of local charities and recreate the ambitious, cold-blooded predator of 1989. In the late 80s, the Denver Police Department was an institution defined by old-school politics, intense internal loyalty, and a desperate desire to maintain a clean public image in the face of rising urban crime rates. Thomas Sterling was the perfect modern face for that institution. He was a master of bureaucratic theater, a man who knew exactly how to leverage a crisis to secure his own advancement. But behind the polished exterior, Sterling possessed a dark, deeply buried obsession with control. He did not view police work as a calling to protect the vulnerable. He viewed it as a grand, intellectual chess match, a game where the laws of ordinary men did not apply to him. Melissa Vance had not been a random target. She had been a quiet, observant student who frequented the university library where Sterling's younger sister worked. Over the course of several months, Sterling had used his badge, his authority, and his access to state databases to stalk Melissa, mapping her routines, her class schedules, and her family's social calendar with the clinical precision of a military operation. Melissa had begun to notice the shadow. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had confided in a close friend that she felt someone was watching her, not from a distance, but from the very structure of the system meant to protect her. She had reported seeing a dark, unmarked police cruiser idling at the corner of her street on multiple occasions, its headlights turned off, its driver obscured by the tinted glass. But in 1989, a young college student reporting a suspicious police vehicle to the police themselves was met with polite dismissal. The desk officers told her it was likely just routine patrols keeping the wealthy neighborhood safe. They had no way of knowing that the predator was already sitting inside the house. The murder on that freezing December night was Sterling's masterpiece. He had chosen the night of the historic blizzard with deliberate, psychopathic foresight. The howling winds and blinding snow drifts would erase any immediate physical evidence, keeping neighbors indoors and delaying the response times of emergency services. He had parked his unmarked cruiser 3 blocks away, walking through the deep snow drifts in heavy, standard-issue tactical boots. He did not need to force his way into the Vance home. He had waited in the shadows of the pine trees until Melissa returned from a late-night study session at the university. When Melissa stepped out of her vehicle, the blizzard blinding her eyes, Sterling had emerged from the darkness. He did not approach her with a weapon. He approached her with his badge, using his official authority to command her attention and disarm her suspicions. It was only when she realized the predatory intent behind his cold, steady gaze that panic set in. She had turned and run, her bare feet slipping and tearing on the jagged ice as she desperately tried to reach the safety of her front door. But Sterling had tracked her with a slow, terrifying patience, knowing that the deep snow would exhaust her within seconds. The strike was instantaneous, delivered with a specialized, heavy-duty tactical spike that Sterling had taken from a confiscated evidence locker weeks prior. The weapon was designed to pierce Kevlar and ballistic material. In Sterling's hands, it was a tool of surgical execution. He had paralyzed her instantly, severing her spinal cord at the brain stem before she could let out a full scream. As she lay dying in the snow, her eyes wide with a final, unutterable horror, Sterling had knelt beside her. He had placed the vintage silver whistle, an heirloom he had stolen from his own father, a retired precinct captain, into her freezing hand, closing her fingers over the word silence carved into the metal. It was his ultimate signature, a private declaration to his peers that he was the one who controlled the streets and that he could silence anyone he chose. When the call came in the next morning, Sterling had volunteered to lead the initial response team. He had walked the very crime scene he had created, directing the forensic technicians away from his own obscured footprints, ensuring that the snow drifts were cleared before any deep plaster casts could be made. He had assumed absolute control of the evidence flow, channeling the investigation away from any suspects who might possess law enforcement ties and focusing the public's attention on phantom drifters and local transients. He had built his own legend on the ashes of Melissa Vance's tragedy, using his prominent role in the high-profile case to secure a promotion to lieutenant within 18 months. For 36 years, the system had protected him, not because of a grand conspiracy, but because of the sheer, terrifying incompetence of institutional loyalty. The Denver Police Department of the 90s did not want to look at its own. They did not want to believe that the monster wearing the silver star was sitting at the head of the briefing table. As the years turned into decades, Sterling rose through the ranks, eventually securing the appointment of chief of police in the early 2000s. He had retired in 2018 with a chest full of medals, a generous municipal pension, and the absolute adoration of a city that believed he had spent his life keeping them safe. But in the quiet of his laboratory, Detective Marcus Reyes was staring at the DNA report that shattered 36 years of institutional myth. The matching profile was undeniable. The genetic markers pulled from the microscopic crevices of the carved word silence were a 1 in a billion match for Thomas Sterling. Reyes sat back in his chair, the green glow of his computer monitor illuminating his pale, sweating face. He knew that the moment he printed this report, he was not just closing a cold case, he was signing a declaration of war against the very department he worked for. Reyes did not immediately call his supervisor. He knew that if he ran this up the traditional chain of command, the report would vanish into the executive offices of the current administration before the ink was even dry. Sterling still had deep, powerful allies within the city government, men he had mentored, detectives he had promoted, and politicians whose careers he had protected. A direct, uncalculated accusation would result in Reyes's immediate suspension, the confiscation of the genetic evidence, and the permanent burial of Melissa Vance's memory. Reyes needed an ally, someone who was entirely outside the sphere of local political influence, someone who possessed the authority to strike at a retired police chief without warning. He picked up his phone, bypassing his precinct commander, and dialed the secure line for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. "This is Detective Reyes, Denver PD homicide," he said, his voice tight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I have an active match on the 1989 Melissa Vance cold case. The suspect is inside the building. I need a federal intervention team, and I need them now before they realize what we've found." The wheels of justice, which had been frozen in the snow of 1989 for 36 years, began to turn with a sudden, violent velocity. The federal agents did not hesitate. They recognized the explosive nature of the data Reyes had secured. Within hours, a covert federal task force was established in an unmarked office building in downtown Denver, entirely separate from police headquarters. The DNA sample was verified by an independent federal laboratory, and a secure, sealed federal arrest warrant was signed by a district judge under the cover of absolute secrecy. As the sun began to set over the Rocky Mountains on that cold winter afternoon in 2026, the modern city of Denver was entirely unaware that the man who had represented their safety for 3 decades was about to be unmasked as their most terrifying predator. The trap was being laid, the federal agents were arming themselves, and the quiet, respectable retirement of Chief Thomas Sterling was about to be shattered by the very silence he had tried to carve into a dead girl's hand. The digital alarm that triggered inside the federal computer system did not just connect a string of genetic markers. It illuminated a dark, hidden corridor of institutional power that had remained protected for nearly 4 decades. For 36 years, the Denver Police Department had treated the murder of Melissa Vance as a sacred wound, a tragic failure that defined a generation of detectives. But when the independent federal laboratory in Chicago finalized the deep sequence extraction from the vintage police whistle, the myth of the elusive, phantom, midnight whistler collapsed. The DNA profile did not point to a shadow in the mountains or a transit passing through the Greyhound station. The genetic coordinates aligned perfectly with the bloodline of Thomas Sterling, the patriarch of Colorado law enforcement. For Detective Marcus Reyes, sitting in a secure, windowless office at the FBI's Denver field office, the weight of the discovery was suffocating. He had spent the last 48 hours under the protective custody of federal marshals, completely cut off from his own department. He knew that the moment the sealed warrant was activated, the history of his city would split into 2 distinct eras, the lie they had all lived under, and the terrifying truth that was about to explode into the open. The federal agents surrounding him were not celebrating. They were preparing for a tactical breach of a man who knew every strategy, every countermeasure, and every blind spot in the city's security matrix. To execute the arrest of a retired police chief without tipping off his deep-seated allies within the modern administration, the FBI deployed a dynamic containment protocol. They mapped Sterling's modern-day routine with a level of clinical scrutiny usually reserved for high-level espionage targets. Thomas Sterling did not live like a man who feared the past. At 78 years old, he resided in a magnificent, custom-built stone manor tucked into the rolling, pine-dense hills of Castle Pines, an ultra-exclusive, gated community south of the city. He was a creature of rigid, military habit, dividing his time between local law enforcement charity boards, morning rounds at a high-end golf club, and long, solitary afternoons in his private home library. It was exactly 6:15 a.m. on a bitter, ice-slicked January morning when the federal convoy moved out. 3 unmarked black SUVs rolled silently past the security gates of Castle Pines, their sirens dark, their tires cutting deep tracks into the freshly fallen powder. The scene was an eerie, deliberate echo of the December night in 1989, the same freezing mountain mist, the same heavy snow locking the landscape in a silent vice. Only this time, the hunter was the one being tracked through the drifts. The tactical team, led by FBI's Special Agent Vance, a seasoned internal affairs investigator with no ties to the Colorado political system, bypassed the long gravel driveway and surrounded the perimeter of the Sterling estate. Thermal imaging units showed a single heat signature moving slowly within the master study on the second floor. Sterling was already awake, dressed in a heavy wool cardigan, sitting at his grand mahogany desk with a cup of black coffee, reviewing the morning's legislative briefs. The breach was completely devoid of sirens or loudspeaker declarations. Agent Vance bypassed the electronic security system using a federal override frequency, and the front door clicked open with a soft, mechanical hiss. Within 10 seconds, 6 heavily armed federal agents moved up the curved oak staircase, their weapons drawn, their movements completely silent on the thick Persian carpets. When the door to the study swung open, Thomas Sterling did not jump. He did not reach for the service weapon mounted inside the quick-release drawer beneath his desk. He slowly lowered his reading glasses, his piercing gray eyes scanning the tactical vests, the federal badges, and finally settling on Detective Marcus Reyes, who stood at the back of the stack. For a long, agonizing second, the room was so quiet that the ticking of a vintage brass marine chronometer on the mantelpiece sounded like a sledgehammer hitting stone. Thomas Sterling, Agent Vance said, his voice flat, carrying the absolute weight of federal authority. You are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant for the 1989 first-degree murder of Melissa Vance, civil rights violations under color of law, and institutional obstruction of justice. A faint, chilling smile touched the corners of Sterling's thin lips, a smile that Reyes recognized instantly from old archive footage of the 1990 press conferences. It was the look of a man who believed he was entirely intellectually superior to the room he was standing in. You've let your imagination run away with you, Agent Vance, Sterling said, his voice a smooth, gravelly baritone that had commanded city council meetings for 2 decades. I spent 40 years building the department you're standing in. I buried Melissa Vance. I carried her casket. To come into my home with this pathetic theater is an insult to the badge you're wearing. Stand up, Chief, Vance replied, unholstering a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The theater is over. We have the whistle. We have the DNA. The mention of the whistle caused the silver-haired patriarch's left eyelid to twitch, a sudden, microscopic fracture in an armor that had held firm for 36 years. He slowly stood up, allowing the agents to secure his wrists behind his back. As they guided him past his desk, Reyes stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the retired chief. You left your signature in her hand, Thomas, Reyes said, his voice trembling slightly with the sheer adrenaline of the moment. The word silence. It didn't hold. Sterling stopped, leaning in slightly toward the young detective, his breath smelling of stale coffee and mint. Secrets don't die in the snow, son, he whispered, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory intensity. They just wait for the right season. As the convoy roared away from the Castle Pines estate, carrying the disgraced chief toward the federal holding facility in downtown Denver, a secondary team of forensic specialists began the systematic, brick-by-brick dismantling of the Sterling mansion. They were not looking for drugs or cash. They were looking for the historical archive of a monster. They brought ground-penetrating radar, digital imaging scanners, and blueprints of the house's foundation. By mid-afternoon, the breakthrough arrived in the basement crawl space, a hidden, reinforced concrete vault concealed behind a wall of vintage wine racks. When the federal locksmith cracked the mechanical dial, the interior revealed a meticulously catalogued chamber of horrors. Thomas Sterling had not just committed a single crime in 1989, he had kept a precise, historical museum of his own depravity. Inside the vault lay 3 shelves of leather-bound journals, stretching from 1985 to 2018. Each volume was written in Sterling's precise, architectural handwriting, detailing not only the absolute reality of Melissa Vance's murder, but a series of other suspicious deaths, accidental, overdoses, and unsolved disappearances that had occurred during his tenure as homicide lieutenant and chief. He had kept the personal tokens of his victims, a silver charm bracelet from a missing high school student in 1992, a graduation ring from a young man dragged from the Platte River in 1997, and the original, unpublished police radio logs from the night Melissa died. But the most devastating piece of evidence inside the vault was an encrypted internal police terminal, a legacy mainframe unit that Sterling had quietly rerouted to his house before his retirement. For 20 years, he had used this terminal to monitor every internal affairs investigation, every cold case review, and every digital inquiry into his own past. He had known exactly who was looking for him, when they were looking, and how to quietly suppress the investigations from the safety of his executive office. Back at the federal building, Detective Reyes sat in the observation room, watching through the one-way glass as Evelyn Reed, the lead federal prosecutor, prepared to begin the preliminary interrogation. Sterling sat in the metal chair, his back perfectly straight, his handcuffs clinking softly as he adjusted his cardigan. He looked like a retired professor waiting to deliver a lecture, entirely unfazed by the global media storm currently gathering outside the courthouse walls. The net had closed around the golden boy of 1989. The files had been unsealed, the journals were being scanned into evidence, and the digital ghosts of his victims were finally emerging from the concrete vault. The city of Denver was about to learn that their greatest protector had been their most terrifying shadow, and the final, devastating chapter of the 1989 winter nightmare was about to be written in the blood of the institution itself. The realization that former police chief Thomas Sterling had kept a meticulously catalogued concrete bunker of his own crimes transformed the federal investigation from a historic cold case breakthrough into a staggering crisis of national confidence. As the digital imaging units and forensic teams continued to pull evidence from the subterranean vault hidden behind the Castle Pines wine cellar, the sheer volume of material began to overwhelm the secure processing rooms at the FBI's Denver field office. Detective Marcus Reyes stood before a massive glass wall that had been hastily converted into an active timeline matrix. The name Melissa Vance was no longer an isolated tragedy stranded in the winter of 1989. It was the genesis point of a 36-year institutional nightmare. Outside the secure facility, the Mile High City was in a state of absolute political gridlock. The current administration had placed the Denver Police Department on immediate, operational standby, while the mayor's office scrambled to address a furious, terrified press corps demanding to know how suspected serial predator could hold the highest law enforcement star in the city for nearly 2 decades. But inside the interrogation wing, the atmosphere remained deathly quiet, insulated from the external chaos by 3-inch thick reinforced steel doors and soundproofed walls. Thomas Sterling sat in the exact center of Interrogation Room C, his posture remaining as unyielding and rigid as a military monument. He had rejected the food and water offered by the federal marshals. He had not requested the presence of his high-priced defense lawyers, nor had he invoked his right to remain silent. Instead, he simply watched the door, his cold, piercing gray eyes locked onto the handle with the absolute, unnerving patience of a hunter waiting in a winter tree stand. When Detective Reyes stepped into the room alongside lead federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed, Sterling did not shift his weight. He merely tilted his head slightly, his gaze tracking the heavy, black leather-bound journal that Reed placed squarely on the steel table between them. It was the volume marked 1989 to 1991, its edges slightly worn, its pages filled with the architectural handwriting that had authorized thousands of warrants during Sterling's career. "You have a very disciplined hand, Chief," Reed began, her voice calculated, flat, and entirely devoid of the theatrical anger that usually filled high-profile cross-examinations. She opened the journal to a page dated December 14th, 1989, the morning after Melissa Vance's body was recovered from the snowdrift in Cherry Creek. "Your logs from this period are remarkably detailed. You kept track of temperature variance, patrol response times, even the specific wind speeds at the crime scene. But there's an entry here, written at 5:30 a.m., just 2 hours after the homicide occurred, that we find particularly interesting." Sterling looked down at the open page, his expression entirely detached, as if he were reviewing the field notes of a complete stranger. "A good detective documents everything, Ms. Reed. The environment dictates the evidence. If you don't record the parameters of the storm, you lose the context of the crime." "Except you weren't documenting the storm to preserve the evidence, Thomas," Detective Reyes interrupted, leaning his hands flat on the table, forcing Sterling to look him in the eye. "You were documenting the storm to see how much time you had before the forensics team would lose your tracks. You wrote here, perimeter drift approaching 6 inches by 0500. Spatial alignment compromised. Original approach, vectors obscured. That wasn't a police report. That was a damage assessment." Sterling's left hand, still cuffed to the steel ring anchored in the center of the table, twitched slightly, the metal links clicking sharply against a cold surface. "You're projecting a narrative onto the notes of a young, overworked investigator, Marcus. I was a lieutenant fighting a historic blizzard to preserve what little sanity that neighborhood had left. The judge's daughter was dead on her lawn. The city wanted blood, and they wanted it before sunrise. I was doing my job. Your job didn't include stealing a vintage silver whistle from the evidence locker of the old 4th Precinct in 1985, Reed said, pulling a secondary document from her folder, a certified internal property audit from 40 years prior that had been flagged during the federal raid. We traced the chain of custody for the whistle you placed in Melissa's hand. It was confiscated during a gambling raid in the 50s, cataloged by your father when he was captain, and then mysteriously vanished from the permanent storage room 3 weeks after you were assigned to the records division as a trainee. You kept it for 4 years, Thomas. Why?" The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy, dead space where the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to amplify with every second. Sterling slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing into 2 slivers of frozen slate. The warm, grandfatherly persona he had cultivated during his retirement completely dissolved, revealing the clinical, predatory intelligence that had allowed him to manipulate the entire Colorado judicial system. "My father spent 30 years clearing the scum off the streets of the city," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly baritone that carried a chilling weight of conviction. "He understood something that modern law enforcement has completely forgotten. He knew that the law is not a shield, it is a mechanism of control. Some people are born to be masters of the system, and others are born to be its casualties. Melissa Vance was a brilliant, beautiful girl, yes, but she was reckless. She looked too closely at things that did not concern her. She spent her afternoons at the university library tracking the financial distributions of the local police pension fund. She was looking for anomalies, trying to build a student thesis on municipal corruption." Reyes felt a cold wave of nausea wash over his chest. "She found your offshore accounts, didn't she? The kickbacks from the construction syndicates operating out of the lower downtown redevelopment sector." "She didn't find anything definitive," Sterling barked, a flash of his old, absolute authority breaking through his clinical exterior. "But she was close enough to cause a tremor. She was going to hand her notes to her father, a federal judge who possessed the specific, unyielding authority to launch a grand jury investigation into our entire division. If that happened, the department would have been torn apart from the inside out. The progress we had made, the stability we had built in Denver throughout the late 80s, all of it would have been sacrificed on the altar of a 19-year-old girl's self-righteous crusade. So you decided to silence her," Reed said, her pen poised over her legal notepad. I decided to protect the institution. Sterling corrected her, his voice entirely devoid of remorse, as if he were explaining a routine administrative decision to a city council board. I used the badge to draw her out. I parked outside her residence, ensured she knew she was being monitored, and waited for the perfect atmospheric window to execute the transition. The blizzard gave me 48 hours of absolute operational immunity. When she stepped out of her car that night, she didn't see a monster. She saw the uniform. She saw the silver star. She walked directly toward me, expecting protection. The look of absolute, shattering comprehension in her eyes when she realized why I was there. That was the only true moment of clarity that neighborhood had ever experienced. And the strike? Reyes asked, his voice tight, his fists clenching beneath the edge of the table. The vertical puncture to the brain stem. Where did you learn that? Sterling let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like dead leaves scraping across concrete. The department used to send its tactical instructors to specialized close-quarters containment seminars in California during the 70s. They taught us how to neutralize an aggressive suspect instantly, silently, without creating a spectacle that would draw a crowd or trigger a riot. It was called anatomical dislocation. I simply refined the technique. A single, clean insertion using a high-density industrial engineering spike. No noise. No struggle. Paralyzed before her brain could even register the drop in blood pressure. She fell into the snow as gently as a sleeping child. And then you forced her to hold your father's whistle, Reed said, her eyes locked on his face. The word silence carved into the silver. It was a threat to anyone else who thought about looking into your books. It was a signature, Ms. Reed, Sterling whispered, leaning forward until his face was inches from the glass partition. It was a message to the inner circle of the administration. They knew exactly what that whistle meant. They knew that if they pushed the investigation into the Vance family too far, the ledger of our pension distributions would be leaked to the federal prosecutors. It was the anchor that kept the entire department in line for 30 years. They didn't cover for me because they loved me. They covered for me because my survival was the only thing standing between them and a federal penitentiary. Reyes stood up, unable to sit across from the monster for another second without breaking his professional composure. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the heavy brass handle, before turning back to look at the man who had defined his entire career path. The net didn't just close around you today, Thomas, Reyes said, his voice steadying into a cold, hard declaration of victory. The federal teams are currently executing secondary search warrants at the residences of the former mayor, the retired district attorney, and 4 of your former precinct commanders. The vault in your basement didn't just give us Melissa's journals. It gave us 30 years of recorded phone calls, bank routing numbers, and signed internal memos. You didn't just preserve the institution, Chief. You built a historical record of its rot, and tonight, the whole house is coming down. Sterling's expression did not crack, but his gray eyes drifted back to the leather-bound journal on the table, the green light from the hallway security monitor casting a long, pale shadow across his silver hair. The silence he had carved into a dead girl's hand 36 years ago had finally become the instrument of his own absolute execution, setting the stage for a judicial reckoning that would reshape the city of Denver forever. The sound of the heavy brass handle locking into place behind Detective Marcus Reyes echoed through the concrete corridor like a gunshot. Inside Interrogation Room C, the air remained thick with a chilling confession of Thomas Sterling. The former chief of police sat beneath the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, his silver hair casting a sharp shadow over the leather-bound journals that had documented his 36-year reign of terror. Outside, in the observation room, Federal Prosecutor Evelyn Reed stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the one-way glass. The realization that Sterling had not acted as a lone predator, but rather as the enforcement mechanism for a sprawling institutional syndicate, transformed the Melissa Vance cold case into a countdown toward a systemic collapse. Detective Reyes leaned against the observation console, his breath heavy, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the digital monitors displaying the live inventory of the Castle Pines concrete vault. The forensic specialists down south were currently uploading page after page of encrypted memos and recorded audio tapes from the late 1990s. This was no longer just about a 19-year-old girl left to freeze in a Cherry Creek cul-de-sac. It was a blueprint of structural rot that touched every tier of Denver's historical elite. He isn't trying to minimize his sentence, Evelyn, Reyes said, his voice flat, hollowed out by the sheer weight of the corruption. He doesn't care about a plea deal. He's bragging. He truly believes that the city would have burned without him. He thinks the murder of Melissa Vance was a civic duty. Then we use his own arrogance to dismantle the remaining network, Reed replied, her finger tapping a newly printed financial analysis report from the Treasury Department. The grand jury is already reviewing the legacy pension funds. But Sterling mentioned an inner circle, precinct commanders, a former district attorney, politicians who signed off on the diversion of funds. If we don't secure the operational details of how they maintain this cover-up through the 90s, their defense teams will claim Sterling is a rogue actor suffering from late-stage cognitive delusion. Reed stepped back into the interrogation room, the steel door closing behind her with a definitive, mechanical thud. Sterling did not look up immediately. He remained fixed in his statuesque posture, his cuffed hands resting perfectly still on the steel table. "Let's talk about the aftermath, Thomas," Reed said, sitting back down in the metal chair opposite the monster. In 1991, 2 years after Melissa Vance was executed, a formal petition was filed by a group of independent city auditors to run a forensic trace on the 4th Precinct's evidence distribution funds. Within 48 hours of that filing, the lead auditor, a man named Arthur Pendleton, died in a suspected hit-and-run on Interstate 25. The case file was handled by your personal homicide unit, and it was classified as an accidental vehicular casualty within a week. You wrote in your journal, "The audit has been neutralized. The vector is stable." Did you pull the trigger on that vehicle, Chief? Sterling slowly raised his head, his gray eyes locking onto Reed with a cold, piercing intensity that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. A hit-and-run in a Midwestern winter is a statistical inevitability, Ms. Reed. You don't need a conspiracy to explain an icy overpass and a driver who panicked. But if you're asking whether I ensured the investigation stayed focused on the environmental factors rather than the victim's political motivations, then yes. I directed the flow. Pendleton was a numbers man. He didn't understand that some equations are meant to remain unbalanced. You protected the people who were paying into the shadow pension, Reed pressed, leaning forward. The construction syndicates that built the lower downtown commercial district. They weren't just paying bribes. They were buying immunity for their own labor violations, their own trafficking networks. And you used the 4th Precinct as their private security force. The city of Denver in the late 80s was dying, Sterling said, his gravelly baritone rising slightly, carrying the resonant, commanding tone of a leader addressing a hostile stadium. The oil crash had emptied the skyscrapers downtown. The streets were crawling with gang warfare, and the municipal tax base was completely dried up. The construction syndicates were the only entities willing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the concrete foundations of this city. They wanted guarantees, Ms. Reed. They wanted to know that if they built the stadiums, the shopping complexes, and the high-rise hotels, their investments wouldn't be compromised by petty local regulations or moral crusades from the district attorney's office. He leaned forward, the links of his handcuffs taut against the steel anchor ring. My father's generation handled the streets with nightsticks and broken ribs. My generation understood that true stability requires capital. I created a secure corridor. The syndicates funded the law enforcement pension, ensuring our officers had the equipment, the vehicles, and the political protection they needed to sweep the real scum off the avenues. Melissa Vance didn't see the macroeconomics of the system. She only saw the numbers on a single balance sheet. She wanted to be a hero, to see her name in the papers as the student who exposed a municipal kickback scheme. She had no comprehension of the chaos that would follow if the police department's primary funding mechanism was dismantled overnight. So you walked through 3 blocks of freezing snow drifts to sever her spinal cord, Reyes said, stepping back into the room, unable to remain a passive observer behind the one-way glass. You stood over a 19-year-old girl while she suffocated in her own blood, all to protect a construction kickback? I stood over a liability, Marcus, Sterling hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that sent a thrill of pure adrenaline down Reyes's spine. I looked at her, and I saw the end of the department. I saw the riots, the federal investigations, the collapse of our operational immunity. If I had allowed her to hand that folder to her father, Judge Vance would have been legally obligated to recuse himself and initiate a federal inquiry. The entire command staff would have been indicted by the spring of 1990. Who would have policed the streets then? Who would have stopped the cartels from taking over the West Side? Sterling tilted his chin up, the fluorescent light reflecting off his weathered, aristocratic features. I made a command decision.
The snow was my ally.
The weapon left no metallic residue, and the silver whistle ensured that the men inside the building understood exactly what the stakes were. The day after the homicide, the City Council approved a 12% increase in our tactical budget, funded directly by the very developers Melissa was investigating. They knew the shadow was protecting them. They knew the cost of doing business in my city. But the whistle had your DNA, Thomas, Reed said, her voice cutting through his self-righteous narrative like a scalpel. You carved the word silence into that metal using a high-carbon engraving tool in your private basement workshop. You thought you wore the proper protective layers, but the forensic vacuum extracted the skin cells trapped beneath the oxidized layer of the silver. 36 years of storage didn't degrade the profile. The system you used to hide your identity is the exact system that has locked you in this chair. Sterling's eyes drifted to the window, his gaze tracking the pale, gray winter light filtering through the reinforced security glass of the outer corridor. For a long, agonizing moment, the room returned to that suffocating silence, the same heavy, dead space that had existed at the Cherry Creek crime scene in 1989. The monster was not searching for an escape. He was realizing that his grand intellectual chess match had reached a definitive checkmate. The system didn't beat me, Ms. Reed, Sterling whispered, his voice returning to a smooth, gravelly calm. Time did. Science changes the rules of the board after the players have already walked away. If this were 1995 or even 2005, your laboratory wouldn't have been able to see the cells. I lived my life by the parameters of my era. I won my game. I retired with honors, I wore the star, and I kept this city from burning for 30 years. You can lock me in a cell, you can strip my name off the precinct walls, but you cannot rewrite the history of the streets I built. We aren't just locking you in a cell, Thomas, Detective Reyes said, leaning in until his face was inches from the disgraced chief's. The federal prosecutors are seeking the death penalty under the revised interstate racketeering statutes for murder for hire and color of law execution. And the vault in your basement? It just finished uploading the audio files from 2002. The recorded phone calls between you and the former governor regarding the judicial appointments. The whole layout is out in the open. Sterling didn't flinch, but his breathing became shallow, his chest rising and falling beneath his heavy wool cardigan in a slow, mechanical rhythm. The silence he had forced upon a dead girl in 1989 had finally turned inside out, becoming a deafening roar of evidence that would echo through the federal courthouses for years to come. The hunter had run out of winter, and the final, devastating collapse of his empire was officially underway. Part 6. The heavy silence of Interrogation Room C was not a static thing. It was a pressurized chamber, compressing 36 years of institutional secrets into a single, volatile point. Outside the double-paned observation glass, the digital recording decks captured every micro-movement of Thomas Sterling's weathered hands. The silver-haired patriarch of Denver law enforcement sat perfectly still, but the slight, rhythmic pulsing of the vein in his temple betrayed the calculating mind working furiously behind his frozen gray eyes. He was a man who had built his entire life on the strategic manipulation of information, yet he was now staring at a young detective and a federal prosecutor who held the literal keys to his subterranean archive. Detective Marcus Reyes did not break eye contact. He let the silence stretch, knowing that every tick of the wall clock was a psychological hammer blow to Sterling's remaining illusions of control. The retired chief had spent decades believing that his historical legacy was untouchable, protected by the very decay of the system he had policed. But the digital upload of the Castle Pines vault was complete, and the green progress bars on the external monitors had transitioned into a vast, categorized directory of systemic blackmail. "You said you built the streets of the city, Thomas," Reyes said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register that cut through the low hum of the ventilation system. "But you didn't build them with concrete. You built them with bodies. And you didn't just stop with Melissa Vance in 1989. Let's talk about the summer of 1994. Let's talk about Detective David Miller." The mention of the name David Miller caused Sterling's hands to tighten imperceptibly against the steel table. The links of his handcuffs let out a single, metallic click. In 1994, David Miller had been a young, idealistic internal affairs investigator who had quietly begun pulling the dispatch logs from the night of Melissa Vance's murder. He had noticed the same discrepancies that Reyes had uncovered decades later. The unexplained delay in the perimeter lock is, the missing patrol car logs from the 4th Precinct, and the sudden, unauthorized promotion of Thomas Sterling to lieutenant shortly after the case went cold. Miller had kept his notes on a yellow legal pad, hiding them inside a locked filing cabinet in his home study. He never got the chance to present his findings. On a warm July night, Miller was found dead in his garage, his vehicle running, the door closed. The official coroner's report, signed off by a medical examiner who had received a quiet promotion under Sterling's recommendation 3 months prior, ruled it a tragic suicide brought on by personal depression. David Miller was a good officer, Sterling said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotional modulation. But he was fragile. The pressure of internal affairs work often isolates a man from his peers. He lost his perspective, Marcus. He began seeing ghosts in every dark corner of the precinct. "He wasn't seeing ghosts, Thomas. He was seeing you," Reyes shot back, leaning forward until his shadow completely eclipsed the light on Sterling's face. "And he didn't lock himself in that garage. We just pulled the decrypted audio files from your Vault's 1994 folder. We have the 3-way call between you, the medical examiner, and the captain of the 4th Precinct. We have your direct instruction to clear the scene before the county coroner can run a toxicology screen. You didn't just cover it up, Chief. You coordinated the execution of one of your own officers." "A department is like a military unit," Sterling said, his gravelly baritone hardening, carrying the cold, practical authority of a general justifying battlefield casualties. "If a soldier begins firing his weapon at his own trench, you do not court-martial him in the middle of an offensive. You neutralize the threat to the unit's survival." David Miller was going to tear the department apart during a critical municipal transition. "We were preparing to secure the funding for the new international airport. The developers needed absolute political stability. If Miller had leaked his half-baked theories to the local press, the entire infrastructure plan would have collapsed. Thousands of jobs, billions of dollars in development, all of it gone because one detective couldn't understand the bigger picture. So you put him in his car, turned the key, and locked the door," Federal Prosecutor Evelyn Reed said, her voice shaking slightly with a mixture of professional disgust and human horror. "I protected the future of Denver," Sterling countered, his voice rising, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute self-righteousness. "Look around you, Ms. Reed. The airport, the stadiums, the revitalized downtown blocks. Those are not the products of prayers and civic committees. They are the products of hard, dirty decisions made in the dark by men who had the stomach to carry the weight. I carried that weight for 40 years so that people like you could sit in these air-conditioned offices and play at being moralists." "You carried the weight of a murderer, Thomas," Reyes said, his voice cold and steady. "And the scale has finally tipped. The federal task force has just confirmed that the ground-penetrating radar at your Castle Pines estate has flagged 3 separate anomalies beneath the concrete floor of your secondary garage pool house. The excavation team is moving in with concrete saws right now. What are they going to find under that slab, Chief?" For the first time since his arrest, Thomas Sterling's jaw tightened. He looked down at the steel table, his eyes tracking the edge of the leather-bound journal as if searching for a line of text that could save him. The absolute, unyielding confidence that had defined his 40-year career was beginning to fracture, revealing the hollow, desperate core of a predator who had finally run out of ground. "You're digging up graves that were meant to remain silent, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his voice dropping to a dry, rattling hiss. You think you're bringing justice to this city, but you are only opening a pit that will swallow every institution you rely on. The modern department cannot survive the truth of how this city was built. If you pull down my legacy, you pull down the foundations of the very badge you're wearing. Then let it burn, Reyes said, his hand resting on the heavy steel door. We'll build something clean on the ashes. Reyes and Reed walked out of interrogation room C, the heavy door locking behind them with a sharp, final click. In the observation room, the tactical displays were a chaotic web of red and blue indicators. The federal task force was executing simultaneous arrest warrants across 4 different counties, arresting active commanders, retired captains, and city officials who had participated in Sterling's shadow syndicate. The 36-year-old silence of the Denver snow had finally been broken, replaced by the deafening roar of a systemic collapse that would reshape the state of Colorado forever. The rhythmic static of the digital recording deck in the observation room felt like a physical heartbeat, keeping time with the rapid unraveling of a 36-year-old empire. Outside the concrete walls of the federal holding facility, the afternoon sun had completely dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, leaving the Denver skyline draped in a cold, electric violet. Inside, Detective Marcus Reyes stood before the glass, his eyes tracing the red and blue tactical icons on the command screen. The federal task force down in Castle Pines had just sent their first live telemetry update from the excavation site at Thomas Sterling's estate. Underneath the pristine, heated concrete slab of the secondary pool house, the ground-penetrating radar had mapped more than just structural anomalies. It had mapped the physical vault of a ghost. As Reyes watched, the feed showed heavy industrial saws cutting through the reinforced concrete, sending clouds of white dust into the freezing night air. Beside him, federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed was on her secure cellular line, her voice dropping to an urgent, sharp whisper as she authorized emergency federal protective orders for 3 retired county judges who had suddenly vanished from their homes within hours of Sterling's arrest. The institutional net was not just closing, it was snapping shut with a violent, unpredictable momentum, and the panic among Denver's old guard was reaching a fever pitch. They found the first casing, Marcus, Reed said, hanging up her phone, her face pale under the harsh LED lights of the command center. The excavation team in Castle Pines. They bypassed the top layer of the slab and hit a steel utility trunk buried 6 feet down, encased in industrial-grade moisture sealant. It's not just old files or records. It's a locker. And the serial numbers on the lock match the inventory of the old 4th Precinct's Evidence Division from 1994. Reyes turned away from the glass, his chest tightening with a cold, familiar dread. David Miller's missing evidence log, he muttered, his mind instantly locking the pieces together. The yellow legal pads he used to map the 4th Precinct's pension funds. When Miller died, his home was wiped clean. The local detectives claimed his wife must have thrown his personal notes away during her grief. But Sterling didn't destroy them. He kept them as his ultimate insurance policy against the developers who funded his rise. And the other 2 anomalies? Reed asked, her eyes searching his face. We're about to find out, Reyes said, grabbing his tactical jacket from the back of his chair. But we can't wait for the excavation to finish. Sterling is sitting in that cell, calculating his next move. He knows his network is trying to clean house before the federal grand jury meets on Monday. If any of those retired judges or precinct commanders flee the country, the prosecution's case for systemic racketeering becomes exponentially harder to prove. We need the names of the active bagmen, and we need them tonight. Reyes pushed open the heavy steel door of interrogation room C, the sharp clack of the security lock echoing off the cinderblock walls. Thomas Sterling had not moved an inch. His hands, still secured by the heavy steel handcuffs to the center ring of the table, looked like carved marble. But as Reyes sat down in the metal chair opposite him, he noticed a subtle shift in the old man's breathing. It was faster, shallower, the physiological betrayal of a master tactician who had just realized his opponent was no longer playing by his rules. The saws are loud, aren't they, Thomas? Reyes said, placing his palms flat on the cold steel table. Even all the way out in Castle Pines, I bet you can hear the sound of that concrete cracking. The forensic team just breached the first utility trunk. They've secured the internal affairs files you stole from David Miller's house in 1994. Sterling did not flinch, but his gray eyes narrowed, tracking the movement of Reyes's hands with a cold, defensive focus. You're celebrating a hollow victory, detective. A trunk of 40-year-old paper is not an indictment. It's a museum of historical curiosity. My lawyers will argue that the evidence was contaminated the moment your federal team used industrial equipment to breach the site without a localized warrant. We didn't need a localized warrant, Chief, Reed said, stepping into the room and dropping a thick, blue-bound folder onto the table. We have an emergency federal security warrant signed by a district judge under the national security exception. Your legacy mainframe terminal didn't just monitor local police data. It crossed state lines, tapping into federal database systems to track the movements of witness protection targets who testified against the construction syndicates in the early 2000s. You weren't just running a local protection racket, Thomas. You were operating an active espionage cell within your own department. Sterling slowly leaned back, the links of his handcuffs taut against the steel anchor. For a long moment, he remained silent, the low, steady hum of the building's climate control system filling the space like static. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its gravelly, commanding boom, dropping to a low, chillingly precise whisper that seemed to vibrate through the concrete floor. "You think you've uncovered a conspiracy, Ms. Reed," Sterling said, his eyes shifting from the prosecutor to Reyes. "But what you've actually done is pull the pin on a grenade that has been keeping this city stable for 40 years. Do you know what Denver was like in the 70s? It was a cesspool of union corruption, street-level mob violence, and a police department that was entirely outgunned. My father's generation tried to fight it with raw force, and all they got were broken jaws and empty coffers. I realized that if you want to control the monster, you don't fight it. You own the lease on its cage." He leaned forward, his face inches from the glare of the fluorescent light. "I didn't seek out the developers. They came to me. They wanted to clean up the lower downtown blocks, to build the commercial hubs that would bring billions of dollars in tourism and corporate investment to Colorado. But they couldn't do it while the street gangs and the union bosses controlled the docks and the construction sites. They offered me a partnership. They funded our tactical divisions, bought our officers the high-end communications gear that the city budget couldn't afford, and in return, I made sure their projects were never delayed by unforeseen civil disruptions or moral crusades from the district attorney's office." "And Melissa Vance?" Reyes asked, his voice dropping to a hard, dangerous register. "She was 19 years old. She was a student, Thomas. She wasn't a union boss or a street-level gangster. She was a kid who looked at a spreadsheet. She was a fuse, Marcus." Sterling snapped, his voice suddenly cracking with a terrifying, wild intensity that made the metal links of his cuffs rattle against the table. "She was a fuse connected to a powder keg that would have blown the entire municipal infrastructure to pieces. Her father, Judge Vance, was already coordinating with a federal task force to audit our pension distributions. If Melissa had handed him that file, the entire command staff would have been in handcuffs by the spring of 1990. The construction on the new airport would have been halted. The developers would have pulled their capital, and Denver would have collapsed into a permanent, bankrupt Rust Belt nightmare. I didn't kill her out of malice. I executed her to keep the lights on in this city." "You executed her because you were terrified of losing your offshore accounts," Reyes countered, his voice steady, his eyes locking onto the retired chief's. "You didn't care about the city. You cared about the $3 million the syndicates had wired to your personal accounts in Grand Cayman through the shell company in Panama. You used her death to prove to your partners that you had the stomach to do whatever it took to protect their investments. The silver whistle wasn't a warning to the department. It was a bill of service to the developers." Sterling's expression went entirely blank, a sudden, bloodless mask of absolute calculations. The grandfatherly, dignified persona he had spent decades cultivating was gone, leaving behind only the cold, mechanical intelligence of a predator that had finally been stripped of its cover. "You're a very smart boy, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his gray eyes locking onto Reyes's badge with a quiet, terrifying malice. But you're still a detective wearing a uniform that I designed. You think the people of this city want the truth? They don't. They want their streets clean, their property values high, and their parks safe for their children. They don't want to know about the blood under the concrete. They want the illusion of safety, and I gave them 36 years of the most beautiful illusion money could buy. If you tear that down, they won't thank you. They will hate you for showing them the price of their comfort. The illusion is dead, Thomas, Reyes said, standing up and heading toward the door. The excavation team just breached the second anomaly under the pool house. They've found the remains of David Miller's vehicle, and they've found the second chest. As Reyes stepped back out into the observation room, the tactical displays on the main wall were flashing with updates from the federal teams down south. The 36-year-old silence of the Cherry Creek blizzard had finally been broken, replaced by the deafening roar of a systemic collapse that would echo through every precinct in Colorado. The hunter had run out of winter, and the final, devastating chapter of his empire was officially underway. Part 8. The structural integrity of the Denver Police Department did not collapse with a dramatic, public explosion. It dissolved quietly, cell by cell, under the fluorescent lights of the Federal Command Center. It was 9:45 p.m. on that bitter, ice-slicked winter evening when the first flatbed transporter, escorted by 4 unmarked federal utility vehicles, rolled into the secure subterranean sally port of the downtown federal building. Atop the flatbed sat the rusted, partially crushed chassis of a 1991 sedan, David Miller's vehicle, dragged from its dark, concrete tomb beneath the Castle Pines pool house. The air in the garage instantly filled with the pungent, heavy stench of damp earth, rotted rubber, and 32 years of trapped, stagnant exhaust. Detective Marcus Reyes stood on the concrete mezzanine overlooking the garage, his arms folded tightly against the biting draft that swept up from the ramp. Beside him, federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed watched as forensic technicians clad in white, protective suits began systematically photographing the vehicle's interior. The driver's side door, warped and rusted shut by decades of moisture, had to be breached using a hydraulic spreader. When the metal finally groaned and popped open, it revealed a preserved, terrifying capsule of a cover-up. The ignition was still turned to the on position. The fuel tank was entirely empty, and trapped in the deep crevices of the steering column were the microscopic, oxidized remnants of a fingerprint that did not belong to David Miller. Sterling was thorough, Reyes said, his voice flat, exhausted, yet sharp with the relentless momentum of the hunt. He didn't just dump the car in a scrapyard where a VIN check might flag it decades later. He brought the crime scene to his own backyard. He poured 6 inches of reinforced concrete over his own victim's vehicle, knowing that as long as he owned the land, no one would ever have the authority to dig it up. It's the ultimate statement of ownership. But he kept the files, Marcus, Reed said, holding a secure digital tablet displaying the real-time cataloging of the second utility chest recovered from the excavation site. Look at this. The second chest didn't contain paper. It contained microfiche, original photographic negatives from a 1989 Cherry Creek crime scene, and the raw, unedited master tapes of the dispatch radio traffic from the 4th Precinct on the night Melissa Vance was killed. He didn't trust his partners to keep their mouths shut, so he kept the exact rope he used to hang them. "Let's go back in," Reyes said, turning toward the heavy steel doors leading back to the interrogation wing. "The excavation down south is almost finished, and the federal marshals just picked up the retired captain of the 4th Precinct, Donald Vance, at a private airstrip in Wyoming. The outer wall is down, Evelyn. It's time to show Sterling the physical weight of his insurance policy." When Reyes and Reed re-entered interrogation room C, the atmosphere had shifted from a clinical inquiry to a heavy, suffocating reckoning. Thomas Sterling looked smaller beneath the buzzing lights, the first pale traces of age-related tremor beginning to show in his cuffed left hand. But his gray eyes remained as sharp and predatory as ever, tracking Reyes's movement with the hyper-vigilant calculation of a cornered beast. On the table, Reed did not place another file. Instead, she set down a clear, heavy evidence bag containing a weathered, plastic-bound notebook, the private pocket log of Detective David Miller, recovered from the sealed steel chest beneath the pool house. The pages were warped by moisture, but the handwriting was pristine, written in the frantic, precise hand of an internal affairs investigator who knew he was running out of time. "We just breached your garage floor, Thomas," Reyes said, sitting directly across from the man who had mentored his mentors. "We found David's car. We found the fingerprint on the steering column. It's a clean, deep partial index print, trapped under the steering wheel cover. Our mobile AFIS unit just finished running the analysis. It doesn't match David Miller. It doesn't match the paramedics who found him. It matches the personal security detail you assigned to him the week before he died, Officer James Cole." Sterling's jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck flaring as he slowly leaned forward, the links of his handcuffs drawing tight. James Cole was a dedicated officer who passed away of natural causes in 2014, detective. You cannot indict a dead man for a 30-year-old vehicular suicide based on a single latent print. "James Cole didn't act alone, Thomas, and you know it," Reed countered, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "We also recovered the audio tape from the second chest, the secure analog tape labeled July 12, 1994. It's a recording of a private line in your old executive office at the 4th Precinct. Do you want to hear what you told Cole when he reported that Miller was getting too close to the pension fund routing codes?" Sterling remained silent, his gaze fixed on the plastic-bound notebook on the table. The silence in the room grew so dense that the low hum of the digital recording decks seemed to amplify, filling the space like the roar of a distant engine. Reed tapped a button on her terminal, and a crackling, static-heavy voice filled the interrogation room. The quality was analog, but the cold, gravelly baritone of the speaker was instantly recognizable. "He's not going to listen to reason, Jim," the recorded voice of Thomas Sterling said over the speaker. "He's got the spreadsheet from the bank in Cherry Creek. He knows the developer payments are bypassing the municipal general fund. If he takes this to the county prosecutor, we lose the airport contract by Friday. You need to close the file. Make it look like the pressure got to him. Use his personal service weapon if you have to, but I want it clean, and I want his home office swept before the shift change." There was a brief, crackling pause on the tape, followed by the flat, robotic response of Officer James Cole. "Understood, Lieutenant. What about the vehicle?" "Put him in the driver's seat," Sterling's recorded voice replied, cold, clinical, and entirely devoid of human hesitation. "Turn the ignition on, lock the garage door, and let the carbon monoxide do the work. The medical examiner is already on our payroll. He'll sign off on the suicide ruling before the family can request an independent autopsy. Just make sure you get those legal pads out of his cabinet. If any of those pension codes are missing, we're all going to be wearing orange by the end of the month." The audio cut out with a sharp, static click. The silence that followed was absolute, a dead, hollow space where the past had finally, violently collided with the present. The grandfatherly, dignified retired chief who had ruled Denver with an iron fist for 2 decades sat completely exposed, his own voice convicting him of premeditated murder, conspiracy, and institutional execution from 3 decades prior. "That tape was your shield, wasn't it, Thomas?" Reyes said, his voice quiet, almost sorrowful. "You kept it to ensure James Cole would never turn on you if the federal government ever started looking into the pension distributions. But Cole is dead. The developers have liquidated their assets, and the only person left standing in the wreckage of this conspiracy is you." Sterling slowly closed his eyes, his head bowing slightly toward his cuffed hands. For a long, agonizing moment, the proud, unyielding posture of the patriarch seemed to collapse, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own recorded words. The grand illusion of his life, the decades of luxury, the clean name, the respect of the community, had been nothing more than a slow-motion countdown to this very room. "You think you've solved a crime, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his voice dry, the gravelly boom completely gone, leaving only the raspy, exhausted tone of an old man who had run out of road. "But you've only pulled the plug on the machine that kept the city alive. The developers, the politicians, the judges, we were the ones who kept the wheels turning. If you publish that tape, you don't just destroy me. You destroy the credibility of every arrest, every warrant, and every conviction this department has secured since 1989. You will set hundreds of real monsters free on appeal. Then we'll fight them on the streets, Thomas, Reyes said, his hand resting on the heavy steel door. But we'll do it with a clean badge. Not with a silver whistle dipped in a 19-year-old girl's blood. Reyes and Reed stood up, leaving the disgraced chief alone with his journals and his ghosts under the harsh, unblinking glare of the fluorescent lights. The net had finally closed, the silence had been shattered, and the trial of the century was officially underway in the Mile High City. The high-definition digital clock on the wall of interrogation room C flickered to 11:14 p.m., its red numbers casting a harsh, artificial glow over the cold steel table. The audio tape of David Miller's execution order had stopped playing, but the physical vibration of Thomas Sterling's recorded voice seemed to linger in the very marrow of the concrete floor. Outside, the tactical monitors displayed a flurry of activity as federal transport teams coordinated the processing of the newly arrested conspirators. But inside this small, soundproof cell, the universe had shrunk to a microscopic battlefield. Detective Marcus Reyes did not break his stance. He remained leaned against the reinforced steel door frame, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes fixed on the silver-haired patriarch. Across from him, Thomas Sterling sat in a state of absolute, statuesque stillness. The tremor in his cuffed left hand had ceased, replaced by a cold, clinical rigidity that radiated from his shoulders. He looked down at the plastic-bound notebook of David Miller, his face as bloodless and expressionless as the concrete slab they had just cut through in Castle Pines. "A recording is a highly malleable medium, Ms. Reed," Sterling finally said, his voice dropping to a smooth, gravelly whisper that carried a chilling lack of resonance. He did not look at the prosecutor, keeping his eyes locked on the weathered notebook. In the modern digital landscape, voice synthesis and atmospheric modeling can construct any narrative your department requires to justify a high-profile political prosecution. My defense team will argue that this tape was fabricated using legacy analog components to create an artificial link between my administration and the tragic suicide of an unstable investigator. This tape wasn't recovered from a digital network, Thomas, Federal Prosecutor Evelyn Reed said, her voice dropping to a hard, unyielding register that cut through his defense like an industrial diamond. It was sealed inside a military-grade, moisture-proof storage trunk, buried 6 feet beneath the concrete foundation of your own private pool house. The vault's lock was coated in an oxidized layer of vintage machine grease that matches the exact chemical composition of the maintenance lubricants used at the 4th Precinct in the mid-90s. The physical tape has been analyzed by the FBI's Forensic Audio Unit in Quantico. The magnetic degradation, the tape hiss frequency, and the mechanical wow and flutter are entirely consistent with an unedited, continuous analog recording made on a magnetic deck in July of 1994. Reed leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the steel table, her face inches from his. "There is no digital manipulation here, Chief. There is only your voice, your signature, and your cold-blooded decision to execute a young father to protect a construction kickback scheme. And we have the third anomaly." Reyes saw the microscopic twitch in Sterling's left eyelid, the same tell that had occurred when they first mentioned the silver whistle. The old man's chest rose and fell in a slow, shallow cycle, his lungs working hard to maintain the illusion of absolute control under the suffocating weight of the evidence. "The third anomaly under the pool house slab wasn't a trunk of files, Thomas," Reyes said, stepping forward until his shadow completely eclipsed the light on Sterling's face. The ground-penetrating radar flagged a secondary concrete vault, cast in reinforced structural epoxy. The excavation team just bypassed the outer barrier. They didn't find old records, and they didn't find a vehicle. They found a shallow, zinc-lined military locker. The silence that followed was heavy, dead, and absolute. The low, steady hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Inside that locker, Reyes continued, his voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp whisper, was a collection of specialized surgical instruments. A set of high-carbon industrial engineering spikes, identical in weight, length, and steel composition to the weapon used to sever Melissa Vance's spinal cord in 1989. But that wasn't all, Chief. Tucked into the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a faded, oil-stained Denver Police Department uniform shirt, was a secondary vintage silver whistle. Sterling slowly raised his eyes, the gray pupils reflecting the harsh fluorescent glare of the room with a cold, predatory light that sent a thrill of pure adrenaline down Reyes's spine. "You didn't just keep one whistle, Thomas," Reyes said, his voice steadying into a definitive declaration of victory. "The whistle you forced into Melissa's hand in 1989 was a duplicate. You kept the original, the one your father, Captain Sterling, actually carried during his patrols in the 1950s. And when we opened that second silver whistle, we found something your father had left behind. We found a small, handwritten scroll of paper tucked inside the cylinder, detailing the original money laundering agreements between the city's early developers and the 4th Precinct's command staff. Your father started the syndicate, Thomas. You didn't build this empire to protect the city. You built it to protect your family's legacy of theft." A sudden, chilling change came over Thomas Sterling. The cold, statuesque posture did not break, but a low, dry chuckle began to rattle in his throat, escalating into a harsh, mocking laugh that bounced off the concrete walls of the cell. It was the sound of a man who had spent 36 years carrying a mountain of secrets, finally realizing that the weight had crushed him. "My father was a visionary, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his eyes flashing with a terrifying, absolute self-righteousness. He looked at the city of Denver in the 1950s and he saw a wild, unmanageable frontier. The politicians were weak, the unions were run by criminals, and the streets were completely lawless. He understood that you cannot police a city like this with a book of rules and a pocketful of good intentions. He created the framework. He went to the developers, the men who actually had the capital to build the highways, the buildings, and the water systems, and he offered them a trade, absolute security in exchange for a permanent share of the municipal infrastructure. He leaned forward, the steel links of his cuffs drawing tight against the center ring, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated conviction. "I didn't inherit a crime syndicate, detective. I inherited a government. When I took over the 4th Precinct, the pension fund was completely dry. The city council was debating laying off a third of our patrol force to balance the budget. Do you know what happens to a city when you remove a third of its police presence? The gangs take the blocks. The drug syndicates take the schools. The entire social contract dissolves into blood. I saved the city. I took the developer payouts, I stabilized the pension, and I made sure my officers had the equipment, the training, and the absolute legal immunity they needed to keep the real monsters off the avenues." "And Melissa Vance?" Reed asked, her pen poised over her legal pad. "She was 19 years old. She was a student, Thomas. She wasn't a gang member, and she wasn't a union boss. She was a child who looked at a balance sheet. She was a liability." Sterling snapped, his voice suddenly exploding into a deafening, gravelly roar that shook the glass partition of the observation room. She was a self-righteous little girl who thought she could use her father's judicial leverage to tear down the entire operational structure of this city. She was going to leak the pension files to the federal grand jury. If that happened, the funding would have dried up in an instant. The developers would have pulled their investments, the department would have been dismantled by federal monitors, and Denver would have collapsed into a ruined, bankrupt wasteland. I looked at her, and I saw a threat to the survival of 300,000 people. I made a command decision. I executed her to preserve the order of the city, and I would do it again tomorrow if the system was threatened. "No, Thomas," Reyes said, his voice quiet, steady, and filled with a cold, devastating clarity. "You didn't do it to protect the city. You did it to protect your own throne. The developers weren't just funding the police pension. They were funding your personal accounts in Grand Cayman. They were buying the private shipping lines, the Castle Pines estate, and the political influence that allowed you to select your own successors. You turned the Denver Police Department into your private mercenary force, and you killed anyone who dared to look closely at the books." Reyes leaned down, his face inches from the disgraced chiefs, his voice a low, burning hiss. "The city didn't need your protection, Thomas. It needed protection from you. And tonight, the shield is gone." Sterling stared at him, his breathing heavy, his chest rising and falling beneath his wool cardigan in a slow, mechanical rhythm. The silence he had carved into Melissa's cold hand 36 years ago had finally collapsed, replaced by the deafening, unstoppable roar of his own legacy turning to dust under the bright, unblinking glare of the federal spotlight. The hunt was over, the concrete had been cut, and the final, devastating chapter of the 1989 winter nightmare was officially closed. The digital clock in the observation room of the federal detention facility clicked to 2:14 a.m. Outside, the freezing wind off the Rocky Mountains rattled the heavy security panes, driving a fresh layer of fine, icy snow against the glass, a quiet, haunting reminder of the storm that had buried Cherry Creek 36 years ago. Inside the command hub, the atmosphere was a pressurized chamber of high-stakes legal maneuvering and forensic data analysis. Detective Marcus Reyes stood before the main interactive display, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale under the harsh glare of the monitors. The structural collapse of the Denver Police Department's old guard was accelerating with terrifying velocity. Following the dramatic, midnight presentation of the audio files and the recovery of David Miller's rusted vehicle from the concrete slab, the federal prosecutors had initiated a sweep of unprecedented proportions. By 1 a.m., federal marshals had executed simultaneous arrest warrants for 5 retired precinct commanders, 2 active captains, and the former district attorney who had signed off on the 1994 suicide ruling. The city's municipal power structure was fracturing in real time, its historical foundations exposed as a sophisticated, self-preserving racketeering enterprise. But inside Interrogation Room C, the man who had orchestrated this entire network sat in absolute, unnerving tranquility. Former Chief Thomas Sterling did not look like a suspect facing the needle under the revised federal color of law execution statutes. He sat with his back perfectly straight, his cuffed hands resting on the cold steel table, his gray eyes fixed on the empty doorway with the clinical patience of a predator waiting in a winter blind. He had not requested water. He had not spoken to the public defender assigned to his initial processing, and he had not attempted to negotiate. He was a master of institutional chess, and he was waiting for Reyes to make the next move. When Reyes pushed open the heavy steel door, the sharp, metallic clack of the security lock echoed off the concrete walls like a starter's pistol. He carried a single, weathered manila folder under his arm, the original, unredacted 1989 case file of Melissa Vance. Behind him, federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed stepped into the room, her expression grim, her fingers clutching a high-security digital tablet displaying the preliminary findings from the newly recovered zinc-lined military locker. "You've spent 36 years telling yourself a beautiful lie, Thomas," Reyes said, sitting directly across from the former chief, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register that carried the immense fatigue of the last 48 hours. "You told yourself that you killed Melissa Vance to protect the city. You told yourself that David Miller had to die to preserve the social order, that the developer kickbacks were just the cost of doing business in a modern metropolis. But the paper trail we just pulled from your father's silver whistle didn't start in the 80s. It started in 1957, in a smoky office in the old 4th Precinct." Sterling did not flinch, but his eyes tracked the manila folder as Reyes laid it flat on the steel table. "A city is not built by saints, Marcus. It is built by pragmatists who understand that the law is a tool of convenience."
My father understood that.
I understood that. You think you're exposing a conspiracy, but you are only documenting the evolution of municipal authority. Your father, Captain Sterling, wasn't a pragmatist, Thomas. He was a thief, Reed said, her voice cutting through his cold composure like a scalpel. The handwritten scroll we recovered from his original patrol whistle details the exact distribution percentages of the early gambling and racketeering protection fees collected from the lower downtown syndicates. It wasn't a pension fund for the officers. It was a private, family-administered trust designed to secure the Sterling family's absolute financial dominance over this department for 3 generations. You didn't kill Melissa Vance to save the police force. You killed her because she had tracked the offshore routing numbers directly to your personal shell companies in Panama, the same companies your father opened in 1974. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The low, steady hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Sterling slowly leaned forward, the steel links of his handcuffs drawing tight against the center ring of the table. The grandfatherly, dignified persona he had spent decades cultivating completely vanished, revealing the raw, clinical intelligence of a predator that had finally been cornered in its own lair. His gray eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying intensity that made the air in the room feel instantly thin. "You speak of theft with the naive moralism of a child, Ms. Reed," Sterling whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated through the steel table. "My father took over a precinct that was entirely abandoned by the municipal government. The officers had no pension, no medical coverage, and no protection from the political whims of a corrupt city hall. He built a system that kept those men loyal to the badge, not to the politicians. When the developers came to us in the 80s, they didn't want to buy a police force. They wanted to buy predictability. They wanted to know that if they invested $500 million into the redevelopment of the city, their progress wouldn't be halted by a strike, a riot, or an audit." He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Reyes's badge. Melissa Vance was a brilliant girl, yes, but she was arrogant. She believed that a 19-year-old student with a stack of bank ledgers had the moral authority to dismantle an infrastructure that kept 300,000 people safe in their beds. She didn't see the macroeconomics of the system. She didn't see that without those developer payments, the department would have been forced to lay off a third of its patrol force. If I had allowed her to hand that folder to her father, Judge Vance would have had no choice but to initiate a federal inquiry. The entire command staff would have been indicted by the spring of 1990. Who would have policed the streets then, Marcus? Who would have stopped the gangs from taking over the West Side? "We would have, Thomas," Reyes said, his voice quiet, steady, and filled with a cold, devastating clarity. "But we would have done it without a killer leading the briefing room. We would have done it with a badge that wasn't bought and paid for by the construction cartels. You didn't execute her to protect the city. You executed her because you were terrified of what would happen if the public realized that the Midnight Whistler, the monster they were locking their doors to protect themselves against, was the very detective standing in front of the television cameras." Reyes pulled a high-resolution, color photograph from the folder and placed it directly on top of the old case file. It was a close-up image of the vintage silver whistle recovered from Melissa's hand in 1989, specifically focusing on the deep, crude engraving of the word silence carved into its side. "We ran a secondary, ultra-deep forensic sweep on this carving yesterday, Thomas," Reyes explained, his finger tapping the image. "Our lab bypassed the oxidized silver layer and examined the microscopic tooling marks left by the engraving blade. The tool used to carve this word wasn't a standard pocket knife or a local jeweler's pen. It was a highly specialized, high-carbon steel machining scribe, the exact tool we recovered from your private basement workshop in Castle Pines. The microscopic imperfections in the blade's edge left a unique, identifiable striation pattern inside the groove of the letter S. It is an absolute, mechanical match for the scribe sitting in your evidence locker right now. You didn't just leave your DNA on her hand, Chief. You left the tool mark of your own hands on the weapon." The mask did not just slip, it shattered. Sterling's face went entirely, horrifyingly blank. The cold, statuesque posture did not break, but the color in his perfect, pale cheeks faded into a dull, bloodless gray. He looked down at the photograph of the whistle, his lips parting slightly as if he were trying to find a line of defense, a loophole, a strategy that could salvage the board. But the pieces had been locked in place. The forensic matches were absolute, the recorded confessions were in federal hands, and the 36-year-old lie had finally run out of winter. "You've played a very tight game, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his voice dropping to a dry, rattling hiss that barely carried across the table. "But you've forgotten the most important rule of the board. If you pull down the king, the entire structure falls with him. You think the people of this city want the truth? They don't. They want their streets clean, their property values high, and their parks safe for their children. They don't want to know about the blood under the concrete. They want the beautiful illusion of safety, and I gave them 36 years of the most perfect illusion money could buy. If you expose this network, if you indict the retired commanders, the judges, and the politicians, you don't just destroy my legacy. You destroy the credibility of every warrant, every arrest, and every conviction this department has secured since 1989. You will set hundreds of real monsters free on appeal. Then we'll fight them on the streets, Thomas, Reyes said, standing up and heading toward the door, his hand resting on the heavy steel handle. But we'll do it with a clean uniform, not with a silver whistle dipped in a 19-year-old girl's blood. Reyes and Reed walked out of interrogation room C, the heavy steel door locking behind them with a sharp, final click. In the observation room, the tactical displays were a chaotic web of red and blue indicators. The federal task force was executing simultaneous arrest warrants across 4 different counties, arresting active commanders, retired captains, and city officials who had participated in Sterling's shadow syndicate. The 36-year-old silence of the Denver blizzard had finally been broken, replaced by the deafening roar of a systemic collapse that would echo through every precinct in Colorado. The hunter had run out of winter, and the final, devastating chapter of his empire was officially underway. The digital clock on the wall of the Federal Command Center silently clicked to 4:45 a.m. Outside, the howling mountain winds of the Rocky Mountains finally began to lose their fury, leaving the city of Denver blanketed under a thick, quiet shroud of white. Inside, the relentless hum of the servers was the only sound keeping time. Detective Marcus Reyes stood by the window, a lukewarm cup of black coffee held tightly between his hands, watching the first faint, icy blue light of dawn crawl over the skyscrapers of downtown. The storm of 1989 had finally run out of snow, and the 36-year-old cold case was officially entering its final, devastating hour. The structural collapse of the Denver Police Department's historical hierarchy was complete. Overnight, the federal indictment of former police chief Thomas Sterling on charges of first-degree capital murder, civil rights violations under color of law, and institutional racketeering had triggered a systemic purge unprecedented in the history of Colorado. The Department of Justice had already released a preliminary statement to the press, and the media lines were a chaotic firestorm of incoming calls, satellite vans, and live broadcasts gathering outside the courthouse. The myth of the heroic, gold medal-wearing chief who had modernized the city's policing was dead, replaced by the clinical, terrifying reality of a generational predator who had used the Silver Star as a license to execute. Arthur Vance, the father of Melissa and the retired federal judge whose early inquiries had triggered the 1989 tragedy, had been notified of the arrest at 2 a.m. He had not spoken to the press. Instead, he had quietly requested to meet Detective Reyes at the federal building. When the elderly judge arrived, escorted by 2 federal marshals, he looked as though a heavy, physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders, his eyes misty but clear as he shook Reyes's hand in the quiet hallway. For 36 years, I looked at the snow every winter and wondered what kind of shadow could walk through a blizzard, take my daughter and leave no trace, Judge Vance whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of immense grief and profound relief. I never imagined that the shadow was the very detective who sat in my living room, drank my coffee, and promised to hunt the killer to the ends of the earth. The shadow is in a cell, Judge, Reyes had replied, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute, unyielding power of the law. And he is never walking out. Inside interrogation room C, the final act of the confrontation was unfolding. Thomas Sterling remained in the metal chair, but his posture had finally begun to yield to the immense, crushing gravity of the evidence. The absolute, intellectual superiority he had projected for 48 hours had completely evaporated, leaving behind a frail, 78-year-old man whose hands trembled within the heavy steel cuffs. The concrete had been sawed, the rusted vehicle of David Miller had been dragged from its tomb, and the original silver whistle, containing the physical record of his father's early corruption, lay on the steel table inside a sealed, transparent evidence bag. Federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed stood at the podium, her voice calm, precise, and entirely devoid of hesitation as she prepared the final deposition documents for the grand jury. "We are finalizing the indictment paperwork, Thomas," Reed said, her pen poised over the signature line. The federal marshals have already processed the retired precinct commanders. Donald Vance has signed a full confession detailing how you used the developer payments to fund your personal offshore accounts in Grand Cayman. There is no defense strategy left on the board. The trial will not be a debate over circumstantial footprints. It will be a public cataloging of your family's 30-year betrayal of this city. Sterling slowly raised his head, his gray eyes looking incredibly old and hollowed out in the cold glare of the fluorescent lights. He did not look at Reed. His gaze was fixed on the silver whistle, the carved word silence reflecting the artificial light like a tiny, mocking beacon of his own failure. "You think you've brought justice to Denver, Marcus," Sterling whispered, his gravelly baritone cracking, the smooth authority completely gone. "But you've only pulled the plug on the machine. The people of this city wanted a protector, and I gave them one. I kept the streets clean, I kept the capital flowing, and I carried the secrets that would have burned this department to the ground. If you destroy my name, you destroy the authority of every officer who wears that badge today." "The badge didn't belong to you, Thomas," Reyes said, stepping up to the table and leaning down until his face was inches from the disgraced chiefs. "It belonged to Melissa Vance. It belonged to David Miller. It belonged to every honest cop who went to work every day believing they were serving a clean system, while you were using their loyalty to build a private concrete fortress for your secrets. We aren't destroying the badge. We're scrubbing your family's blood off of it." Sterling stared at him, his lips parting slightly, but no words came out. The absolute silence he had enforced upon Melissa's cold, freezing hand in 1989 had finally turned inside out, becoming a deafening, inescapable chorus of evidence that would lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The game was over. The hunter had run out of winter, the concrete had been cut, and the final checkmate had been executed. At 6 a.m., the federal transport van rolled out of the subterranean Sally Port under heavy armed escort, carrying Thomas Sterling toward the maximum security holding wing at the federal penitentiary. As the vehicle disappeared into the gray, early morning mist, Reyes stood on the steps of the courthouse, his jacket collar turned up against the biting mountain air. Beside him, Evelyn Reed watched the red taillights of the convoy fade into the distance, her expression solemn, yet deeply resolved. "What happens now, Marcus?" she asked, her breath blooming in the freezing air. "We go back to work," Reyes said, his voice quiet but carrying a deep, emotional warmth that seemed to cut through the cold of the morning. "We have 36 years of files to review. We have to find every name Sterling tried to erase, and we have to bring them home." Reyes walked down the concrete steps of the courthouse, his boots crunching softly on the fresh, clean powder that had fallen during the night. The city of Denver was finally waking up, the neon lights of the skyscrapers turning off as the golden light of the winter sun broke over the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The air felt clean, sharp, and incredibly fresh, as if the massive, suffocating shadow that had hung over the city for 3 decades had finally melted away with the dawn. 2 weeks later, the sky over the Denver cemetery was a brilliant, cloudless blue. There were no cameras, no political speeches, and no high society press teams. The crowd gathered around the small, manicured plot of land was tiny. Only Detective Marcus Reyes, federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed, Judge Arthur Vance, and a handful of retired investigators who had never forgotten the girl in the snow. At the center of the green lawn, a beautiful, polished granite headstone sat bathed in the warm, golden light of the mountain sun. It did not bear the anonymous, dusty labels of a cold case file. Carved deep into the stone in elegant, clean letters was a name that had finally been restored to its rightful place in the history of the city. Melissa Vance. September 14th, 1970 to December 14th, 1989. The snow has cleared. The silence is broken. Reyes stood by the grave, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets, watching as Judge Vance slowly knelt down to place a single, fresh white rose against the base of the stone. The elderly man's shoulders shook slightly as he wept, but his face was peaceful, his eyes reflecting the brilliant, clear light of the Colorado sky. Reyes reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, velvet-lined display box containing the vintage silver whistle. The federal court had officially released it from the active evidence inventory after Sterling's formal indictment, allowing it to be returned to the family as a historical artifact of justice. Reyes stepped forward, kneeling beside the judge, and placed the small box gently on top of the granite stone. "It's over, Judge," Reyes whispered, his voice carrying a profound, quiet sincerity that seemed to echo through the peaceful silence of the cemetery. "Melissa is finally free, and the shadow is gone forever." As Reyes stood up and walked slowly back toward the path, he looked back one last time at the grave. The sun was catching the polished edges of the granite headstone, and the silver whistle gleamed in the light like a star. The cold case of 1989 was no longer cold. The circle was closed, the predator was locked in a cage of his own making, and the truth, 36 years in the making, had finally, beautifully set the mile-high city free.
Part 12.
The quiet of the cemetery did not signal an end to the work. It was merely the calm before the largest institutional trial in the history of the Rocky Mountain West. By the spring of 2026, the federal courthouse in downtown Denver had been transformed into a virtual fortress. Barriers lined the perimeter of the building, television satellite trucks blocked the adjacent avenues, and armed federal marshals stood guard at every entrance. The public, which had lived for 36 years under the carefully constructed illusion of safety curated by Thomas Sterling, was demanding a complete accounting of the rot. Detective Marcus Reyes sat in the witness preparation room on the 4th floor, the morning light cutting sharp, geometric angles through the blinds. On the table before him sat the final, compiled trial brief, a document that had grown to over 3,000 pages of forensic data, financial flowcharts, decrypted audio transcripts, and physical evidence logs. The defense team representing Sterling had spent the last 3 months attempting to dissect the prosecution's case, filing dozens of motions to suppress the DNA evidence, the wiretap recordings, and the contents of the Castle Pines concrete vault. But their efforts had been systematically dismantled by lead federal prosecutor Evelyn Reed. "Sterling is going to try to turn the courtroom into his personal theater, Marcus," Reed said, stepping into the room and dropping a fresh stack of court transcripts onto the table. "He's rejected every plea offer. He wants to take the stand. He still believes that if he can speak directly to the jury, he can convince them that his actions were the only thing that kept the city from collapsing during the economic crash of the late 80s. He doesn't understand that the city he thinks he saved has already moved on," Reyes said, his voice quiet, steady, and carrying the hard-won clarity of a detective who had spent months living in the dark with Sterling's secrets. "The jurors aren't the developers or the politicians of 1989. They are ordinary people who had to lock their doors for 30 years because they thought a phantom monster was walking through the snow. They don't care about his infrastructure contracts. They care about Melissa." At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy oak doors of courtroom 402 swung open. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity, reporters from every national news outlet, retired officers who had served under Sterling's command, and members of the Vance family, including the elderly Judge Arthur Vance, who sat in the front row, his hands resting heavily on his cane. When Thomas Sterling was led into the room, a collective, sharp intake of breath rustled through the crowd. He was no longer dressed in his tailored suits or his decorated police uniform. He wore a simple, dark gray suit provided by the state, his wrists secured by a subtle, beneath-the-coat transport chain that clinked softly with every step. Yet, despite the physical markers of his fall, he held his head high, his piercing gray eyes scanning the gallery with the same cold, analytical authority he had possessed when he sat in the chief's office. The prosecution's presentation of the case was a masterclass in clinical, chronological exposure. Evelyn Reed did not rely on emotional rhetoric or sensationalist declarations. She let the physical evidence speak for itself. She introduced the vintage silver whistle recovered from Melissa's frozen hand, detailing the microscopic toolmark matches that linked the carved word silence directly to the engraving scribe found in Sterling's private workshop. She played the decrypted audio tapes of the 1994 execution order of David Miller, the cold, flat baritone of Sterling's voice echoing through the silent courtroom like a physical blow. But the true climax of the trial came on the 5th day, When the prosecution called its chief surviving witness to the stand, Donald Vance, the retired captain of the 4th Precinct who had served as Sterling's primary operational coordinator during the 90s. Donald Vance was an old man, his face weathered by years of heavy drinking and the suffocating guilt of a lifetime of cover-ups. As he took the oath, his eyes kept darting toward the defense table, where Sterling sat entirely motionless, his gaze locked onto his former captain with a cold, terrifying intensity. "Captain Vance," Reed asked, stepping to the center of the courtroom. "In December of 1989, immediately following the murder of Melissa Vance, did you receive any direct, verbal instructions from then-Detective Thomas Sterling regarding the management of the Cherry Creek crime scene?" Donald Vance swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand. He took a long, slow breath, looking away from Sterling and focusing on the jury box. "Yes," Vance whispered, his voice raspy, barely carrying over the quiet hum of the courtroom's microphone. "Sterling came to the precinct at 5 a.m., before the first patrol cars had even secured the perimeter. He told me that the snow was our window. He said we had to get the body processed and the scene cleared before the temperature rose and the track started to melt. He personally directed the forensic team to focus on the outer perimeter, away from the specific footprints leading toward the pine trees where he had parked his car." "And the silver whistle?" Reed pressed. "Did you question why a vintage police whistle was found in the victim's hand?" "I knew what it was the moment I saw the crime scene photos," Vance admitted, a tear cutting through the deep creases of his cheek. "It was the captain's whistle. Sterling's father's whistle. We all knew what it meant. It was a signal. It meant that this wasn't a random street crime. It was a division matter. It meant we had to protect the pipeline. If the federal grand jury started auditing our accounts, we were all going to federal prison. So we kept our mouths shut. We routed the investigation toward phantom transients and drifters, and we made sure any detective who started asking the wrong questions was quietly transferred out of the homicide unit." "Like Detective David Miller in 1994? Reed asked. "Like David," Vance sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "David wouldn't let it go. He had found the routing numbers for the offshore developer accounts. When he went missing, Sterling told us he had committed suicide because of the stress. But when we found his car buried under the pool house slab during the federal raid last month, I realized that Sterling had personally ordered his execution. He used Jim Cole to do the job, and then he buried the evidence in his own backyard to ensure he would always have a hammer to keep the rest of us in line." The defense's cross-examination of Vance was aggressive, attempting to paint the retired captain as a corrupt, self-preserving liar who was fabricating stories to secure a reduced sentence from the federal prosecutors. But the damage had already been done. The physical reality of David Miller's rusted vehicle, combined with the matching fingerprints and the decrypted audio recordings, created an unbreakable chain of complicity that no legal maneuvering could sever. On the 8th day of the trial, against the explicit advice of his defense counsel, Thomas Sterling took the stand. The courtroom was dead silent as the former chief walked slowly to the witness box, his movements deliberate, his expression entirely composed. He did not look like a man on trial for capital murder. He looked like a statesman preparing to deliver a final, definitive address on the nature of power and the survival of the city. "Mr. Sterling," his defense attorney began, keeping his distance. "You have heard the testimony of Donald Vance, the forensic reports, and the audio recordings submitted by the prosecution. How do you respond to these allegations?" Sterling leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the wooden railing of the witness box. He looked directly at the jurors, his voice returning to that smooth, gravelly baritone that had commanded Denver's political circles for nearly 2 decades. "The law is a very beautiful concept on paper, ladies and gentlemen," Sterling said, his tone conversational, almost paternal. "It is an easy thing to sit in a warm courtroom in 2026 and judge the decisions made in the freezing dark of 1989. But a city is not built by theories. It is built by concrete, by capital, and by the hard, heavy choices that keep the chaos from breaching the gates." He pointed a finger toward the window, his eyes flashing with a sudden, intense light. "In the late 80s, this city was dying. The oil crash had gutted our economy, The streets were crawling with gangs, and the police department was entirely abandoned by a bankrupt city hall. The construction syndicates were the only entities willing to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the foundations of the new Denver. They wanted guarantees of stability, and I gave them those guarantees. I stabilized our pension, bought our officers the equipment they needed to keep the peace, and kept this city from collapsing into an urban wasteland. By executing a 19-year-old girl? Evelyn Reed's voice cut through his self-righteous narrative like a physical blade as she stood up for the prosecution's cross-examination. By neutralizing a threat to the survival of 300,000 people. Sterling roared, his hand slamming down on the railing, the sudden, violent sound echoing off the high ceilings of the courtroom. Melissa Vance did not understand the system she was trying to destroy. She was a child playing with fire, trying to leak the pension files to a federal grand jury to satisfy her own naive sense of morality. If she had succeeded, the funding would have vanished, the developers would have pulled their capital, and this department would have been dismantled overnight. I did not kill her out of anger or malice, Ms. Reed. I executed her as a command decision to preserve the order of the city, and I would do the exact same thing again today if the survival of the institution was at stake. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. Several of the jurors looked away, visibly repulsed by the clinical, unrepentant cruelty of the man sitting before them. In the front row of the gallery, Judge Arthur Vance closed his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane, his breathing heavy with the final, terrible confirmation of how his daughter had died. Reyes watched Sterling from the prosecution table, a wave of profound, solemn justice washing over his chest. The chief's confession was complete. He had not begged for mercy, he had not denied the physical actions, and he had not attempted to hide behind a legal loophole. He had laid his cold, psychopathic philosophy bare for the world to see, believing until the very end that his badge gave him the authority of a god. The jury's deliberation lasted for less than 3 hours. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was packed to the doors, the atmosphere charged with the electric tension of a historic reckoning. Thomas Sterling stood facing the jury box, his hands folded in front of him, his face an impenetrable mask of gray stone. On the count of first-degree murder under color of law in the death of Melissa Vance, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit federal racketeering and institutional execution, guilty. On the count of first-degree murder under color of law in the death of Detective David Miller, guilty. The word guilty was repeated 13 times, echoing through the silent room like a succession of heavy, closing doors. Sterling did not flinch, his eyes remaining fixed on the jury foreman with a cold, unchanging glare. He had lived his life by the rules of his own shadow empire, and he received his condemnation with the same icy detachment. 2 months later, the final sentencing hearing was convened. Under the federal statutes for murder for hire and civil rights executions, the prosecution had sought the absolute maximum penalty. Federal Judge Margaret Brennan, her expression grim as she looked down at the disgraced chief from her high bench, delivered the final, crushing judgment of the court. Thomas Sterling, Judge Brennan said, her voice carrying the absolute, unyielding power of the federal government. You spent 40 years wearing the star of the city, using the trust of the citizens of Denver to build a private, blood-soaked fortress of personal wealth and institutional terror. You executed a young woman who sought your protection. You murdered one of your own officers who had the courage to look for the truth, and you